Hello, tes.
ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಿದೆ ಸರ್, ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಿದೆ.
Hello.
Sharam, you have to pick the English channel in the interpretation icon. Don't stay on off.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. We are waiting for some more attendees to join, and we'll be starting in a few minutes. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, Lalita.
Hello.
Yes, Lalita. Vishmi, could you please reply?
ලාලිතා ඔයා මේ සිංහල channel එකේ ඉන්න ඕනේ.
හරි සිංහල channel එකේ තමයි මේ ඉන්නේ.
ඕකේ. ඔයාට නටාෂාව ඇහෙනව නේද?
ඇහෙනවා. තව පොඩ්ඩක් අයියෙන් කතා කරන්න කියන්න තව පොඩ්ඩක්.
right හරි.
All of you can quickly check your audio and video. We did a quick check and it was working fine for everyone. If there are any issues, please check your audio and video quickly and we'll go live in a few minutes.
Hi, this is Ananya.
Hi, this is Ashim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good evening. This is Nasir Mansoor from Pakistan.
Hi, this is Ashmita.
Do you have video? There you are. Hi, Nasir.
Hi.
This is Ratna. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Ratna.
Hi.
Hi, Lalita, Textile Garment and Clothing Workers Union.
Hi, Lalita.
This is Gary at Duke University.
Hi, Gary.
I'm Joko from
Hello.
Dartek, Indonesia.
Hi, Joko.
Hello, this is Shahram from Bucknell University in Pennsylvania.
Hi, Sharam.
This is Dave from India.
Hi, Dave. I think we tested your video earlier, yeah?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mora from Katu, Cambodia.
Hey, Mora. Rukmini is here. I saw her earlier. Rukmini, is your video working, Rukmini? Ah, there you are. Hi, Rukmini. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi.
Stephanie, is your video working? She may have gone away.
Okay, so we are starting with a small video so that everyone gets an idea of the program schedule for today, and then we'll just dive into the first session. Thank you.
Please warn us when you are going public.
Yes, Ananya. We are just sharing a video for now.
Hey, I request all the speakers, especially
Hi, we are live on YouTube now, and we are starting with our event. We'll start with a few tech announcements. So Ashmita will be speaking about the announcements with you. Please listen carefully.
Hello, everyone. Using audio interpretation, I have some announcement to make. You can choose a preferred language by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of the toolbar on your device screen. Available languages are Bangla for Bangladesh, Khmer for Cambodia, Hindi, Kannada, and India Tamil for India, Bahasa for Indonesia, Urdu for Pakistan, Sinhala and Sri Lanka Tamil for Sri Lanka, and English. Please note, due to Zoom's limitations, we're using Korean channel for India Tamil, Russian channel for Urdu, Japanese channel for Sri Lanka Tamil, and Portuguese channel for Hindi. Other languages are accessible on audio channels under their respective names. This event is being recorded. We have the chat box and Q&A box open for participants. Please type in your comments and questions at any time throughout the event. We will take questions through Q&A box after each panel discussion. This event is being live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. Link is in the chat box. Please show us some support by live tweeting about this event using the hashtag #EndWageTheftNow. Thank you.
Ananya, we can start.
Okay. Good evening from Asia. Good morning and good afternoon to people in other time zones. I am Ananya Bhattacharjee. I'm the International Coordinator of Asia Floorwedge Alliance. And it's my honor to welcome you today to the first of the two-part global series that we are organizing. Today's panel is on the pandemic time wage theft in the global garment industry. We have received a huge response to this event. 550 people have registered across 45 countries. And this is not counting union members of our member unions who are watching in small groups. Before opening the proceedings, I would like to share with you a bit about our journey over the last year, which has brought us here. In March 2020, the entire world began to experience the historic pandemic. By April of last year, Asia Floorwedge Alliance and our member trade unions did a rapid assessment with workers as the crisis came upon us. And we estimated that workers would lose about 60 days of wages during the peak period of the pandemic. We immediately formulated a demand and made it public called Supply Chain Relief Contribution, SRC. We wrote to several brands to make a one-time contribution of 2% of their total past annual sourcing directly to each of their suppliers so that workers could get paid, because we anticipated a huge wage loss. It's a very modest demand. However, we got no response. We all watched in horror as the crisis unfolded, and we watched the range of irresponsible practices by global brands. That was also the time when the ILO call to action started. The ILO call to action was a high-level, high-profile attempt to help developing countries and workers. However, they did not require for brands to make any contribution, but they asked brands to join it. Brands hid behind the ILO call to action, in which they did not have to shell out any money. And today, after a year, we have seen that in spite of such a high-profile attempt, nothing meaningful has really happened. In fact, last year in a meeting with one major global brand, whom I will not name here today, a senior head of that brand boasted about how their brand was leading the ILO call to action effort and told us in Asia Floorwedge Alliance to join that and stop all these other strategies. But our partner trade unions could see the brand's lack of response, and they wanted to push for a more determined strategy. That's when we decided to do this research to build evidence and quantify wage theft and hold accountable brands whose actions lead to wage theft. We wanted to carry out this research, but we did it under the toughest conditions of lockdowns, terminations, relief work, COVID illnesses and deaths, retaliation, intimidation. As one person, one friend told us, this had to be a labor of love. It took the immense commitment of trade unionists, field researchers, the courage of workers in telling their stories in spite of the fear of retaliation. The Asia Floor Wage Alliance team also showed a tremendous amount of dedication and perseverance. Due to all these collective efforts, we have today the most in-depth, the most rigorous, and a significant size study across the largest production region, Asia. 1 year into the pandemic, we have seen governments and suppliers in Asian countries do something. Some have done very little and some have done a bit more, but they have all tried to do something. However, the brands who are the actual benefactors of this supply chain have done nothing. Not only have they not done anything, they have actively inflicted gross damage to the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers. I would like to open the proceedings today by inviting the first speaker, Nivedita Jairam. She is the Asia Coordinator for Labor Rights in Asia Floor Wage Alliance. She has coordinated this whole effort across Asia patiently and diligently, and has also been part of this research team. I would like to request all speakers to speak a little slowly, knowing that we have simultaneous translation going on in 9 languages. Nivedita, the floor is yours. Nivedita, we cannot hear you. Are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so the link to the report is going to be in the chat box right now. And I'm going to take you quickly through the main findings and the recommendations of the report. The report places a lot of emphasis on the wage theft experienced by workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is because wage theft was actually the most common experience of workers. And even though we recorded many different forms of labor exploitation through our research, wage theft was actually the most devastating consequence of labor exploitation during COVID-19. A major question is that whether all types of wage loss constitute wage theft. Several Asian production countries actually have laws that protect the wages of workers. But during the pandemic, workers who were fearful of further loss of jobs if they challenged these legal violations by accessing national laws, did not do so. In any case, over and above national laws, workers expect decent employment and wage protection, especially in the supply chains of major brands, because these are basic rights that are legitimized by international normative standards.
Nivedita?
Workers already had poverty level wages even prior to the
Nivedita?
Sorry?
Could you please speak slowly? Translators are not able to keep up. Sorry.
Okay. Workers already had poverty level wages even prior to the pandemic, and this prevents them from having any form of resilience in the form of savings, assets, or even vertical mobility for better work and living standards to be able to tide over any loss of wages, even for a short period of time. Wage theft is actually intrinsic to the business models of brands, and it was not an unintended result of the pandemic. Rather, it operates through an inbuilt mechanism through which brands pass on the costs and risks of manufacturing to their suppliers and ultimately to workers in their supply chains. During the pandemic, what we saw was simply an exacerbation and an aggravation of this inbuilt mechanism of wage theft. And this is because the current unregulated and asymmetrical nature of global supply chains allows brands to amass super profits through human rights violations of workers in the form of wage theft. This is basically enabled through different features of the supply chain. One is the extreme asymmetrical power relations that inform supply chains and form the basis of wage theft. Basically, brands project themselves falsely as buyers of garments produced in Asian production countries, creating intense competition between a large number of suppliers in production countries to offer very low value manufacturing by pushing down labor costs. And it creates a race to the bottom between Asian production countries to offer cheaper and more flexible labor in order to retain the businesses of the brands. What we witnessed during the pandemic was more coercive suppression of production costs in this manner and through that labor costs, leading to wage theft. Wage theft has a huge human rights impact. This is because wage is a precondition for the survival of workers and their households, and it mediates their access to all other human rights. National governments and international normative frameworks have recognized that living wage is central to social justice. However, the business models of brands remain antithetical to this recognition, as we saw during the pandemic, leading to human rights violation in the form of wage theft. Lack of regulation in global supply chains actually perpetuates this wage theft. The highly profitable businesses of brands are actually driven by coercive and deeply entrenched management practices in their supply chains, and lack of regulation allows brands to engage in an extreme justice while paying lip service to certain principles. And as a result, workers subsidize the stabilization and recovery of brand profits through wage. Coming to the focus of the research, we basically studied the impact of the pandemic-induced recession on garment workers employed in the supplier factories of major global brands by looking at certain aspects such as the adverse shifts in the employment relations of garment workers with suppliers. We looked at the extent and types of wage theft that was experienced by garment workers as a result of the shifts in their employment relationships, and the impact of this wage theft on garment workers and their families' ability to access basic human rights, as well as the coping strategies that workers utilized to cope with loss of wages and the long and short-term consequences that this had on their households. Going through methodology very quickly, the methodology is given in detail in the methodology chapter of the report. So the sample size is basically 2,185 workers in 189 supplier factories located in 6 countries, which supply to 15 major global brands. We had 3 tools for data collection, which was a structured interview schedule that was administered to workers, a factory profile that was administered to trade unions in order to triangulate this information and collect data on overall workforce, as well as qualitative.
Stay slow, Nivedita. Stay slow.
As well as qualitative interviews and focus group discussions to understand quantitative trends better. We also calculated actual wage theft and wage theft estimates for each of these countries. We used a representative sample at the factory level to the extent possible. This meant a proportionate representation of gender, contract type, department, and job role. If any, there was an underestimation due to focus on unionized or regular workers who fare relatively better. The data that we collected from the pre-recession period, which is January and February 2020, has been considered as the reference for calculating shifts in key variables during the pandemic-induced recession period, which is March to December 2020. Coming to the major findings of the research, we did observe adverse shifts in the employment relationships leading to an extreme deprivation of wages and benefits of workers. While this was actually permitted through different labor exploitative practices, the main cause of this was a reduction in work days through a change in the employment status of workers through layoffs and terminations. As a result, workers were trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and indebtedness. The pre-pandemic situation of workers actually exacerbated and was exacerbated by the crisis. Wages were at poverty levels even prior to the pandemic, and they were pushed below the international poverty line during the pandemic. The household income of workers, which is the total income of all working members and other forms of income, fell short of the Afwa living wage, even prior to the pandemic. But this disparity actually increased during the pandemic. Over the years, despite an increase in age and experience, wages of workers have remained stagnant over their lifetime, which meant that they didn't have increased wages, which could have allowed them to tide over the pandemic crisis, with workers who had 5 to 10 years of experience in an average, not having the capacity to even lose wages for a few weeks without triggering a huge humanitarian crisis for them. Workers basically coped by engaging in their own physical and mental degradation in the present and by mortgaging of their future in order to cope with the crisis and cope with wage loss. This meant that they took on more and more debt to finance very survival level and substandard consumption of food, nutrition, housing, education, healthcare, and other expenses, which are basic consumption requirements of any household. This had both immediate impacts in terms of reduced consumption during the pandemic, as well as very long-term impacts in terms of intergenerational transfer of poverty, in terms of long-term indebtedness, and a loss of meager assets as workers sold their assets to tide over wage theft. What we saw was that 74% of the total workforce, which is around 500,000 workers across 189 factories in 6 countries, were pushed below the World Bank poverty line in 2020 due to the pandemic-related wage theft. This is a table which summarizes how workers lost work days, the extent of wage theft that they suffered, and as a result of which they were pushed below the poverty line and their debt increased. Workers actually took on debt for very basic things like reduced consumption of food and shelter, while they cut down on children's education and critical medicines. And you can see the extent to which their debt increased as a result of wage theft to enable such subpar consumption. This table sort of summarizes the wage theft experienced by workers across different countries. The column on the left is actually comparable across countries because it shows wage theft per factory. Overall, across the surveyed factories, the workers lost 157 million US dollars during 2020. The management practices of brands are what resulted in wage theft in their supply chains is one of the main inferences of our research. The research shows the link between brands' management practices when contracting out their production and the labor management practices used by the suppliers in supplier factories that impact workers and cause wage theft. The management practices of brands have a cascading effect that leads to different forms of wage theft in their supplier factories. So basically, wage theft becomes a net impact of the deeply entrenched and harmful management practices of brands on workers. Through this, we've made a typology of the managerial practices and wage theft suffered by workers at the Asia regional level by summarizing the different forms of wage theft that we saw across countries. What we see is that the management practices of brands are actually a way through which they transfer risk to suppliers and workers, allowing them to run risk-free businesses, which forms the basis of their super profits. These management practices are basically a unilateral kind of action by brands on cost-cutting decisions that actually affect suppliers and workers, but without consulting them. A refusal to share the costs when adjusting their business to the consequence arising out of the pandemic. And in leveraging of the jurisdictional and governance weaknesses in production countries, which is actually poverty level wages and low enforcement levels, in order to evade liability for the violations that are perpetrated in their supply chains. So basically, these actions have had a cascading effect, which leads to exploitative employment practices in their supplier factories and ultimately translating to different types of wage theft for workers. This is a summary of the different types of managerial practices which lead to harmful employment practices and different forms of wage theft that is caused by it. We saw that suppliers engaged in the use of power to change the employment status of workers across countries. And this was in the form of a failure to recognize the seniority of workers by breaking their service period, replacing more secure employment contracts with more precarious contracts, such as rehiring permanent workers as short-term contract workers, or the wrongful designation of permanent workers as contract workers and refusing to recognize that they become permanent workers after a certain number of years in the factory. This leads to a reduction in wages due to demotion. This leads to a reduction in benefits due to a shift in the contract type. Suppliers also engaged in very arbitrary practices to impose flexibility on the workforce. What they did was basically engage in layoff and termination to reduce the size of the workforce and cut costs. But at the same time, a smaller workforce was basically forced to engage in greater intensity of work and extend their workday in order to meet the demands of production. This led to, again, a loss of termination benefits, a loss of wages, as well as unpaid and underpaid overtime for the small workforce who is now undertaking a greater number of hours of work as well as greater intensity of labor per hour. Suppliers also,
if you can start wrapping up.
Yeah. Suppliers also engaged in very deceptive practices to evade liability, which meant a manipulation of work-related documentation and termination of workers under the guise of disciplinary action. They also engage in unethical practices to leverage existing vulnerability in the workforce, which meant replacement of vulnerable workers with other workers, which meant more layoffs of vulnerable workers, rehiring, not prioritizing vulnerable workers during rehiring, or forcing more vulnerable workers to work longer hours without pay. Also, there was a denial of bonus, social security, and provision of other key features like creches, transportation, etc., which are key security benefits to workers who are already facing poverty level wages. The main inferences from our report then is that stagnation of workers' wages at poverty levels leads to a lack of resilience against any form of crisis. Wage theft of workers with poverty level wages forms a major human rights violation. Brands actually caused and contributed to these human rights violations in their supply chains. Workers ended up providing a reverse labor subsidy for the super profits of brands, leading to a mining of workers' bodies to stabilize and recover brand profits. This meant that integration into the existing asymmetrical global garment supply chains has not led to development gains for workers as has been encouraged by international policy bodies or academics. Global garment supply chains have actually exacerbated pre-existing inequalities during the pandemic, especially heightened economic violence against women and deepening of gender disparity. There have been several forced labor features such as unpaid and underpaid overtime, severe indebtedness due to wage theft, which were commonplace during the pandemic. Looking at the conclusion and the way forward, Asian unions actually did rapid response in April 2020 as Ananya already
जो एशियाई यूनियन थे उन्होंने बहुत त्वरित कार्रवाई करते हुए
There's also been a demand for a new social contract, which has at its core social protection against employment loss. And the Severance Guarantee Fund, financed by brands, is an example of this. What is needed is transformative shifts in the structure of governance of supply chains for a fair redistribution of power and profits. This is possible through a global readjustment towards higher prices required for the payment of living wages by both consumer markets and brands through a pricing model that enables adequate compensation and fair redistribution of profits. There's also a need for strong labor market institutions to promote union-driven and monitored processes for payment of living wages. An example of this is the Wage Forward campaign. There's also a need to relook at the transnational commercial relationships between brands and suppliers, to redefine brand liability and open up the possibility of joint employer liability of apparel brands with suppliers in production countries. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nivedita, for a challenging job on such a huge presentation in a very short amount of time. I would like to now invite Oshim Roy. Oshim is a senior national trade union leader in India. He is the founding general secretary of New Trade Union Initiative. He's been an innovator who has been involved in multiple initiatives nationally and globally. He has been part of the Asia Floor Wage Alliance core team from the beginning and is a member of Asia Floor Wage's International Secretariat. Oshim will be the moderator of the next panel, which is a panel of trade union leaders. Oshim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ananya, and thank you, Nivedita, for such a rendering of such a complex report that we are trying to present here today. We will actually in this first part mostly allow our union colleagues and union friends to express how they actually saw things as it unfolded in their own country. But I'll make two very broad points. One, which is that this is one of the possibly first research report which has actually come from a very active participation of more than 5 unions from actually from 6 countries in Asia. And that's a very significant in itself, because it was something that emerged actually from the concerns on the ground, on the factory level. And that's why the factory level has become the focal point of our report. And we have looked at the problems and the concerns that emerge in the factory and then link it up to the global supply chain in order to really build the relationship between brands and the factory linkages. If you look at the initial motivation of the union, it was just to get a relief. We just wanted, as active participants in our factories where we deal with the workers, to see that we could give some relief. But faced with the kind of silence, or faced with the kind of almost wall of silence against the real humanitarian crisis, I think we all felt an urgency to really speak the truth to the brands and everyone, and say what exactly is happening in this factories. And that is why the unions really participated so intensely, in fact, shaping the methodology in some sense, allowing their members and activists to really go and collect, and in that process understand and convince the workers to see that the global supply chain is an important element in their life and how they should really change it. So it became a part of our own trade union experience and struggle. The report is the first step, as we all should know as a unionist. It's a first step, and we intend to take this report not only for the purpose of really building a discourse, but also for taking up the action, and which will be the part of the next panel that you will the next day when we will discuss the issues about how we take it forward. The second core important point which I want to just bring here is that, Asia Floor Wage, it's in a 15-year-long history. We began with debunking the idea that the brands were propagating earlier, that they are actually contributing to the development of the countries, which they do to a certain extent because it expanded the industry in some sense. But in terms of really contribution to the families of the workers, it hardly made the change in terms of the poverty level of the families. Essentially, the whole idea that the wages that they were giving was something at a living wage level was something we proved wrong. And we showed that the poverty level wages, the legal wages, is something which has a norm in most of the countries. And some of the countries, it is even below the poverty level wages in where the production takes place. But I think what makes this, and in the last 2 decades, the extensive research, not only from activists, but from academic and the brand's own consultants have shown the extensive kind of non-payment and the wage theft that takes place in terms of overtime wages and other factors. What I think this report makes it much more clearer that this is very intrinsic to the global supply chain. And we really want to pinpoint and say what is real, that it is not just a wage loss, it is something that we want to define and build a whole narrative that if you take away our legal wage at the poverty level, please don't say it's a wage loss. It is actually a wage theft. And like all theft, someone has to take responsibility. And if they don't take responsibility, someone will make you accountable for that theft that actually is happening in the global supply chain. So with these words, I really feel that we have a panel of 6 of our very important trade union leaders from different countries, and they will give you a brief experience both about the report and what happened when we were making this report, and some of the key issues that actually has, they saw as they really looked at the pandemic unfolding in their country. And I'll begin with really one of our very powerful woman worker leader, a trade unionist from Sri Lanka. She's a chief organizer of the Textile and Garment Including Workers Union. It's a very woman-led, woman membership-based, and one of the few women organizations that are actually fighting at the front line of the trade union movement in Asia. And I think what Lalita would be able to give is that how, as a woman organizer, and particularly in the free trade zone, which has become the foundation of many of these exploitative framework, what is the experience of the trade unions and garment workers, particularly women workers in those areas? So Lalita, please say what you have experienced in the last 1 year. Lalita?
පළමුවෙන් සියලුම දෙනාට සුබ උදෑසනක් සහ සුබ සන්ධ්‍යාවක්. පළමුවෙන්ම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා මේ අවස්ථාව ලබා දීම පිළිබඳව. ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ COVID-19 ව්‍යසනයේ ආරම්භයේ සිටම ලංකාවේ ඇතිවුණු තත්ත්වයන් පිළිබඳව විශේෂයෙන් ඇඟලුම් අංශයට බලපා ඇති ආකාරය පිළිබඳව තමයි කෙටියෙන් කරුණු ඉදිරිපත් කරන්නේ. මීට සුළු මොහොතකට ආසියානු අපේ ඒසියා ෆ්ලෝවේජ් වාර්තාවේ සඳහන් වුණා අපි ගොඩක් වෙලාවට ඉදිරිපත් කරන කරුණු. ඒ අත්දැකීම් බෙදා ගන්න අවස්ථාවක් ලැබුණා. බහුතරයක්ම තමයි මේ රට තුල පවතින මේ වෘත්තීය සමිති ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ කඩා වැටීම සහ වෘත්තීය සමිති වෙතට සේවකයන්ට සංවිධානය වීමට තියෙන අයිතිය දිගෙන් දිගටම ඒක අවහිර කරලා අධෛර්ය කරලා මේ සියලු ආකාරයෙන් බාධාවල් පමුණුලා තියෙනවා.
Lalita, can you pause for a minute, and the translator, please? We are overhearing another interpreter. Technical team, please fix this. Yeah, I request Lalita and the translator to continue.
Benny, I'm sorry, Benny, you are on the wrong channel. Please switch back. Thank you.
I request technical team to please help when these things happen. Lalita and the translator, please continue. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead, Lalita.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Lalita.
එතකොට මේ තත්ත්වයන් නිසා ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ කම්කරුවන්ගේ එක් කම්කරු ප්‍රමිතීන් වල ගොඩාක් පහත් තත්ත්වයන් පත්යන් ඇති වෙලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට කම්කරුවන්ට කේවල් කිරීමට තියෙන හැකියාවන් සහ ඔවුන්ගේ බලය දුර්වල කරලා තියෙනවා. සමස්තයක් හැටියට ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වෘත්තීය සමිති ක්‍රියාදරයන්ට අපි වගේම අපේ අනිකුත් සහෝදර සංගම් වලට මේ දියත් කරන වැඩපිළිවෙල වලට බාධා පමුණුවලා ඒ කියන්නේ වපරැහින් බලලා වෘත්තීය සමිති කියන්නේ මේ රටේ ඉන්න කම්කරුවන්ට තියෙන අයිතිවාසිකමක් නෙමෙයි ඒක නිකන් සතුරු ඒවා විනාශ කරන ආකල්පයක් තමයි මේ වන විට මේ ශ්‍රී ලංකාව තුල විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ නිදහස් වෙනද කලාපවල සහෝදර සහෝදරයන්ට ඇති වී තියෙන්නේ. මේ තත්ත්වය තුල අපගේ සමාජිකයන්ට විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ පළවෙනි කොවිඩ් රැල්ලේ ඔවුන්ගේ රැකියාවල් ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කිරීම වලට ගොඩාක්ම ලක් වෙලා තියෙනවා. කර්මාන්ත ශාලා එම සේවකයන්ගේ කොන්ත්‍රාත්තු කියන්නේ අවසන් කරන්න හැම විටම උත්සාහ කරේ ඔවුන්ව සේවයෙන් අස්කරොත් වන්දි ගෙවන්න සිදුවන නිසායි. එතකොට ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ තියෙන නීති අනුව කම්කරුවන්ව රැකියාවල් වලින් නිරපාහැරීමක් නැත්නම් ඉවත් කිරීමක් සිදු වෙනවා නම් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වන්දි ආඥා පනත අනුව වන්දි ගෙවිය යුතු සේවා කාලය අනුව වන්දි ගෙවිය යුතු ක්‍රමවේදයක් තියෙනවා. එතකොට මේ COVID-19 කාල සීමාව තුළ එවැනි අවස්ථාවකට කොහෙත්ම ඉඩකඩක් ලැබුණේ නැහැ. මෑතකදී සිදු ප්‍රචණ්ඩකාරී අත්දැකීමක් මේ පරේක්ෂණය කිරීමට අපි ගිය වෙලාවේදී මුහුණ දුන්නු අපේ සමාජිකයෝ ක්‍රියාකාරීන් මුහුණ දුන්නු අවස්ථාවක් පැහැදිලි කරන්න කැමතියි. තොරතුරු එකතු කිරීම සහ දැනුවත් කිරීමට අප කොග්ගල අපනයන සැකසුම් කලාපයේ ඒ ක්‍රියාකාරකම් කරන අවස්ථාවක එක්තරා ආයතනයක කළමනාකාර පාර්ශවයක් විසින් මෙහෙයවනු ලබන මැරයන් ලවා අපට තර්ජනය කළා. ඔවුන් අපට අපේ පසුපසම හඹ ඇවිල්ලා අපට ප්‍රකාශ කරේ නැවත මේ වගේ ක්‍රියාකාරකම් ඒ කියන්නේ වෘත්තීය සමිති ක්‍රියාකාරකම් කරන්න આવොත් අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම අපට හානියක් බලපෑමක් කරනවාමයි කියන එකයි. එතකොට ඇත්තෙන්ම කියනවා නම් මේ දත්ත එක්ස්ප්‍රෙස් කිරීමේදී නොයෙකුත් බාධාවන් වලට මුහුණ දීමට සිද්ධ වුණා. වසංගත තත්ත්වය නිසා කර්මාන්ත ශාලා කළමනාකරන සේවකයන් ගැන වැඩි අවධානයක් යොමු කරමින් හිටියේ ඒ සේවකයෝ කොහෙද යන්නේ ඔවුන්ගේ ගමන් බිමන් මොනවද ඔවුන් කවුද ආශ්‍රය කරන්නේ කියන ඒවා ගැන වැඩි අවධානයක් යොමු කරා. එතකොට ඒ යොමු කිරීමේදී ඔගොල්ලෝ ඒ අය ගොඩක් වෙලාවට බලාපොරොත්තු වුණේ කර්මාන්ත ශාලාවන් තුල මේ COVID-19 ව්‍යසනය නිසා පවතින වෘත්තීය අයිතිවාසිකම් මානව අයිතිවාසිකම් ඒ කඩවීම එළියට යන එක මග හරින්න තමයි මේ දේවල් සියල්ලක්ම කරේ. එතකොට ඒ දේවල් අනුගමනය කරනකොට සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම ප්‍රතිරූපයක් මැව්වා මේ නිදහස් වෙන කලාප තුළ රැකියාවල් අහිමි වෙනවා කියන එක පිළිබඳව. එතකොට මේ කර්මාන්ත ශාලාවල පැහැදිලිවම යම්කිසි ආකාරයක හිංසනයට ලක් වෙන දේවල් එහි ප්‍රතිඵලයක් ලෙස කම්කරුවන් අපිත් සමග තොරතුරු බෙදා ගැනීමට අපේ ක්‍රියාකාරීන් සහ සමස්ත අය මැලිකමක් දැක්වීමක් සිද්ධ කළා. මෙවැනි තත්ත්වයක් තුළ තොරතුරු ලබා ගැනීමට උත්සාහ කර අපගේ සෙසු සංවිධාන සහ වෘත්තීය සමිතිද මුහුණ දුන්නේ සේවකයන් බයවන නිසා ඒ පිටට තොරතුරු ගලා යාම නිසා රැකියාවල් අහිමි වෙයි කියන එක තමයි. මුත් වැටුප් අලාභ මේ පරිශ්‍රණයේදී අවශ්‍ය දත්ත ලබා ගැනීමේදී මේ නිසා බොහෝ දුෂ්කරතාවයන්ට අපට මුහුණ දෙන්න සිද්ධ වුණා. දැන් කම්කරුවන්ගේ අයිතිවාසිකම් වෙනුවෙන් කටයුතු කරන ආයතනයක් ලෙස අපට සැලකිය යුතු කාලයක් තිස්සේ අපි කටයුතු කරනවා. ඒක කලමනාකාරණය, ඒ කියන්නේ හාම්පුතුන් මේ බිය ගැන්වීම හේතුවෙන් කරගෙන යන සේවකයන්ගේ විශේෂයෙන් වෙළඳ නිදහස් වෙළඳ කලාපවල සංවිධානය වීමේ වෘත්තීය සමිතියකට බැඳීමේ අයිතිය සංවිධානය වීමේ අයිතිය ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම මේ COVID-19 ව්‍යසනයත් එක්ක පෙරටත් වඩා කප්පාදු කිරීමකට ලක් වෙලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට මෙවැනි දුෂ්කරතාවයන් මැද්දේ කම්කරුවන්ගේ සුබ සිද්ධිය වෙනුවෙන් ක්‍රියාකාරීව කටයුතු කරන වෘත්තීය සමිති සහ සංවිධාන වලින් මේ කාල සීමාවල් තුල යම් තාක් දුරට ඒවලව මන්දගාමී තත්වයකට පත් කරලා තියෙනවා. ඒකම ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ දැනට පත් කරගෙන තියෙන මේ COVID-19 ව්‍යසනයත් එක්ක ඒ කාර්ය සාධක බලකායේ මුල්ම පිටුව ඉන්නේ අපේ රටේ යුද හමුදාපති. එතුමාමයි පත් කළා තියෙන්නේ. මෙම කාර්ය සාධක බලකාය තුලින් කොවිඩ් මාර්ගෝපදේශක නිසියාකාරව ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙනවද? නීති රීති වැනි දේවල් පිළිබඳව තීන්දුව తీරන ගැනීම ඒ නිසාම වසංගත තත්ත්වය හේතු කොටගෙන රටේ හැම පැත්තකින්ම යම්කිසි මට්ටමක මිලිටරි කරණයක් දැන් අපිට දැක ගන්න ලැබිලා තියෙනවා. මේ වෘත්තීය සමිති වශයෙන් අපගේ හඬ යටපත් කරලා තියෙනවා. මේ පාලනය අපේ වෘත්තීය සමිති අපි කම්කරුවන් වෙනුවෙන් නියෝජනය කරන ප්‍රජාවගේ අයිතිවාසිකම් වෙනුවෙන් අපේ හඬ යටපත් කරන තත්වයකට දැන් පත් වෙලා තියෙනවා. මෙය තව දුරටත් දවසින් දවස ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ නරක අතට තමයි හැරීගෙන යන්නේ. දැන් සේවකයන්ට ඔවුන්ට සිදුවේ ඇති අසාධාරණකම් ගැන පිටතට ඇවිත් කතා කරන්න ඔවුන් දවසින් දවස මැලිකමක් දක්වනවා. කම්කරුවන්ගේ ශ්‍රමය සූරාකාමයට ලක් වෙනවා. රස්සාවල් ඔවුන් කරන්නේ තෘප්තිමත්ව නෙමෙයි. ඔවුන්ගේ අවශ්‍යතාවයන් කේවල් කිරීමේ බලයක් හෝ වෘත්තීය සමිතිය වලට බැඳීමට ඇති අයිතිය අද අයිමි වෙලා තියෙනවා.
Lalita has been muted. Yeah.
ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ ඇඟලුම් කර්මාන්ත ශාලාවකින්. එතකොට මේක ඇත්තටම කබලෙන් ලිපට වැටුණා හා සමාන තත්වයකට තමයි තවත් මේ කම්කරුවන් පත් උනේ. එතෙන්දී ඒ අයගේ ආත්ම ගරුත්වයට ඉතාමත්ම මේ COVID-19 කියන ව්‍යසනය කොහොමද ශරීරගත වුණේ කියන එකට පවා මේ කාන්තාවන්ට ගොඩක් වෙලාට මුහුණ දෙන්න සිදු වුණේ ඒක වෛරසයක් හැටියට නෙමෙයි. Taman වෙනත් විකල්ප දේවල් අහලා ගියා කියන තත්යකට උඩ තමයි. විශේෂයෙන්ම ඒ සේවකයෝ නිරෝධායන මධ්‍යස්ථාන වලට පහසුකම් නැති ඒ ගෙන යන අවස්ථාවල් වලදී ඉතාමත්ම රටේ පවතින නිරෝධායන නීති රීති අනුගමනය නොකරමින් තමයි මේ ස්ථාන කරා ඔවුන්ව ගෙන ගියේ. එතකොට මේ අය රැගෙන යනකොට සමාජ දුරස්ථභාවය තිබුණේ නැහැ. සෞඛ්‍ය නිර්දේශ පිළිගත් තැකීමක් කරේ නැහැ. එතකොට අදාළ නිලධාරීන් Tamanට තිබෙන වගකීම සහ රාජකාරිය හරියට ඉටු නොකර සේවකයන්ගේ අඩුපාඩු සහ අවශ්‍යතාව සොයා බලන්නේ නැතුව මේ අයගේ මූලික අයිතිවාසිකම් කප්පා දුනා. එතකොට වියලි සලාක රජෙන් ඒ බෙදා දෙනකොට මේ වෘත්තීය සමිති සහ බිම් මට්ටමේ ආයතන වෙත ලොකු කාර්යභාරයක් මේ මොහොතේ පැවරිලා තිබුණා. මෑන් පවර් සේවකයන්ගේ අයිතිවාසිකම් වැටුප් ලැබීම් ඒ වගේ දේවල් ගොඩක් ඒගොල්ලන්ට අද වෙනතුරුත් අහිමි වෙලා තියෙනවා. මුළු වසංගත කාලය පුරාවටම අසාධාරණයට පත් වෙලා තියෙන නිසා
Lalita, you have to wrap up.
Please, we are taking already double the time.
Yeah, please wrap up.
Huh? හරි නිදහස් වෙළඳ කලාපයේ සේවකයන්ට බහුතරයක් දෙනාට තම පළාත් වලින් සංක්‍රමණික සේවකයන් නිසා මේ වෙළඳ කලාපවල උන්ට ස්ථිර පදිංචියක් තිබුණේ නැහැ. ඒ නිසා ඒගොල්ලන්ට රජෙන් දෙන ඒ සහනාධාර ඒ සියලු දේවල් ලබා ගැනීමට අවස්ථාවක් ලැබුණේ නැහැ. මේ ප්‍රමාණවත් අනපේක්ෂිත වසංගත කාලය නිසා මගේ කාලයත් අවසන් වීම නිසා මම පොඩ්ඩක් පැහැදිලි කරන්න කැමතියි අපේ සංගමයත් මේ COVID-19 ව්‍යසනය සම්බන්ධව effect of COVID-19 on workers, human and employment rights in free trade zone and private sector companies of Sri Lanka කියන
Thank you, Lalita. We have to move to the next speaker. A lot of the information is also in the report.
Okay.
Can you, can we move on, Lalita? Thank you.
Thank you,
Lalita. Okay. අවසාන වශයෙන් මම කියන්න කැමතියි.
Thank you.
මේ තත්ත්වය. Hello.
The last sentence.
අවසාන වශයෙන් කියන්න කැමතියි තව සාරාංශගත කරගත්ත කාරණා කීපයක් තියෙනවා වේලාව නැති නිසා ඒක ඒ අවස්ථාවට ඉඩ දෙන්න ඕන. අපි කියන්නේ පීඩිත කම්කරු ජනතාවගේ අයිතිවාසිකම් දවසින් දවස යටපත් වෙන මේ මොහොතේ ජාතික සහ ජාත්‍යන්තර කම්කරු නීති රීතිවලට වටිනාකමක් දීලා විශේෂයෙන්ම 87 සංවිධානය වීමේ අයිතිය සහ 98 කේවල් කිරීමේ අයිතිය ලබා දීමට අදාළ බලධාරීන් අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම කටයුතු කළ යුතුයි. වෘත්තීය සමිති මර්ධනය නැති කළ යුතුයි. ඒ නිදහස මේ සියලු දෙනාටම ලැබිය යුතුයි. ස්තුතියි.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lalita. Sorry for rushing you a bit, but we are really crossing a lot of time. We should be really sharp on that. So, without getting more into the issues, I would invite Ari Joko. Ari Joko is actually the general chairperson of the Federation of Trade Union and Garment and Textile. GARTEX is a very big union, one of the most important garment workers union in Indonesia, and is a part of a larger trade movement, which is again a very important part of the union movement in Indonesia, and is also a member in the Higher Standing Committee. The union is a member of that Higher Standing Committee, so it's a very important union. And Ari, we would like you to really say the two things, because you have been involved as a union chief in the social dialogue which has been initiated on the safety and health, and what has been your experience on that? That one. And second thing, recently there has been a lot of legislative change and challenges that the country is facing in terms of labor law, and how does the union movement and your organization particularly see this unfolding in the time of the pandemic? Yes, Ari, your flow.
Baik, terima kasih Brother Hashim. Ya, yang pertama-tama saya sampaikan bahwa terima kasih kepada AFWA Indonesia, saya bisa ada di forum ini karena AFWA Indonesia. Dan tentunya saya selaku Ketua Umum FSB GARTEX, ya, KSBC Indonesia, bisa berbagi sebuah fakta-fakta bagaimana terkait dengan situasi COVID di Indonesia, dan bagaimana dan apa yang kami lakukan di Indonesia selama COVID berlangsung. Baik, terima kasih. Yang pertama-tama adalah perlu saya sampaikan bahwa saat ini semua negara mengalami lonjakan COVID yang luar biasa. Begitu juga dengan Indonesia. Indonesia saat ini terdata kasus sudah mencapai 2.220 ya per Juli per hari ini ya. Kemudian untuk pasien sembuh itu ada 1.900.000 ya. Sisanya kemudian itu masih 300.000 itu masih dalam perawatan dan penyembuhan. Nah, bagaimana dengan dampak situasi COVID ini kepada pekerja buruh di sektor 3SL? Bisa sampaikan di sini bahwa sektor 3SL adalah sektor yang banyak menyerap tenaga kerja yang ada di Indonesia. Dan mereka saat ini terkena banyak dampak daripada situasi COVID, lonjakan COVID Delta yang saat ini melanda seluruh dunia, ya, tidak terkecuali di Indonesia yang saat ini sedang mencapai puncaknya, ya, kenaikan daripada COVID tersebut. Nah, banyak serikat melakukan upaya-upaya penanggulangan, mencari solusi daripada berbagai persoalan-persoalan, ya, bagaimana solusi ini bisa bermanfaat bagi anggota, bagi pekerja yang ada di Indonesia. Nah, apa yang Gartek lakukan? Gartek melakukan sebuah terobosan-terobosan, di mana terobosan-terobosan itu adalah strategi partnership yang kami lakukan di Indonesia. Yang pertama adalah bagaimana kami membangun joint commitment. Membangun joint commitment bersama dengan asosiasi pengusaha, APindo, API, ya, Asosiasi Pertekstilan Indonesia, kemudian Asosiasi Persepatuan Indonesia. Ya, kebetulan apa yang kami lakukan ini adalah diinisiasi oleh Better Work Indonesia. Nah, di dalam joint commitment itu, ya, itu bagaimana kita menciptakan sebuah solusi-solusi penting bagi dunia kerja, bagi buruh pekerja di Indonesia. Yang pertama adalah bagaimana joint commitment itu bisa memberikan perlindungan kepada pekerja-pekerja di Indonesia, mereka yang periode Mei sampai dengan September itu sangat tinggi sekali PHK yang terjadi. Baik mereka yang PHK maupun mereka yang dirumahkan. Kalau kita melihat data yang ada di Kementerian Tenaga Kerja Republik Indonesia, data kehilangan pekerjaan, ya, mereka kehilangan pekerjaan oleh karena PHK, dirumahkan maupun pengurangan upah adalah sebesar 29,4 juta tenaga kerja mereka yang kehilangan pekerjaan. Nah, tentunya ini sangat besar sekali. Nah, dalam kerangka joint commitment di dalam perlindungan itu, kita mencoba membangun komitmen dengan dunia usaha, bagaimana pengusaha sebisa mungkin, semaksimal mungkin, mengupayakan tidak terjadi pemutusan hubungan kerja oleh karena situasi COVID. Ini memang berat sekali, ini memang berat sekali bagi dunia usaha. Mengapa demikian? Oleh karena memang tidak ada peran brand di dalam memberikan insentif kepada dunia usaha hingga sampai saat ini. Kalau kita tegas mengatakan, ya, seperti itu. Nah, kemudian yang kedua adalah yang paling esensi adalah terkait dengan keselamatan dalam situasi COVID ini. Bagaimana perusahaan kita minta, ya, dalam joint commitment itu kita tekankan bagaimana perusahaan semua menerapkan protokol COVID, ya, protokol COVID sebaik-baiknya sehingga klaster COVID itu tidak sampai sedemikian besar terhadap industri-industri yang ada di padat karya TGSL ini. Itu yang kita tekankan di dalam joint commitment. Kemudian yang ketiga adalah bagaimana kita memastikan serikat buruh, serikat pekerja itu terkait keberlangsungan dunia usaha. Nah, keberlangsungan dunia usaha sudah sangat terancam dengan adanya pemberhentian order dari pihak buyer. Ya, kemudian dibatalkan order dari pihak buyer, kemudian dihilangkan order dari pihak buyer. Ini sangat menghantam daripada dunia usaha yang ada di Indonesia. Sehingga kita mencoba untuk mendorong pelaku-pelaku usaha untuk bagaimana mereka bisa merubah pola perilaku untuk menyelamatkan tenaga kerja mereka, merubah identitas produksinya. Dari sebelumnya mereka mengerjakan garment, ya, baju, kemudian mereka berubah menjadi masker. Seperti itu contohnya ya. Kemudian tentunya bagaimana peningkatan kesejahteraan buruh pekerja tersebut juga diperhatikan di dalam joint commitment. Ini yang sangat penting kita lakukan. Nah, kemudian apa yang Gartek lakukan? Apa yang Gartek lakukan dengan organisasi partner kita, ya, dengan AFWA, ya?
Joko, we have to start wrapping up. Thank you. If you can start concluding, Dina, if you can translate for me.
Oke, sorry ya. Oke, baik. Kita dengan AFWA Internasional ya, kita berkolaborasi bagaimana kita membangun gugatan kepada pihak buyer. Oleh karena yang saya sampaikan tadi bahwa selama ini tidak ada peran sama sekali buyer terkait dengan kondisi COVID yang ada di Indonesia. Oleh karena itu kita ingin melakukan gugatan hukum kepada buyer supaya bagaimana buyer bertanggung jawab terhadap krisis, membantu dunia usaha, bagaimana meringankan mereka dengan membayar upah pekerja. Itu yang kita lakukan dengan AFWA. Kemudian yang ketiga dengan organisasi partner kita adalah dengan Clean Code Campaign, kita juga melakukan aksi bersama-sama di situ dengan aksi Pay Your Workers di situ ya. Bagaimana kita juga sama dengan AFWA kolaborasi ini untuk menekan buyer tetap bertanggung jawab untuk menyelesaikan persoalan-persoalan yang ada di industri melalui simulasi upah, melalui bantuan-bantuan upah yang diberikan kepada dunia usaha.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Wish we could hear more of you, but unfortunately the time is running out. I'll go straight to Nasir. Mansoor, who is actually a very important trade union from National Trade Union Federation of Pakistan. Unfortunately, he just had a very tragic. His mother expired just yesterday. So first, I want to really give condolence from all our friends and from Asia Florage family to you, Nasir. So just want to know a bit more about in Pakistan. और आपसे कोशिश करें कि आप थोड़े इसको कम समय में पूरा कर दें. So Nasir, please. Is Nasir there? Hello.
जी.
हाँ, तो आप बोलिए.
अच्छा, मैं समझ रहा था मेरा सेशन अभी नहीं है.
नहीं, आपका है.
I'm sorry.
Please
yes,
go ahead, Nasir. Yeah.
Please
How much time I have?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
How many?
2 minutes. Sorry. हमारे बहुत वरिष्ठ senior academic people are waiting on the line and we do want to cut this short.
मुझे क्या contribute क्या करना है थोड़ा सा?
नहीं, आप बोलिए. Go ahead, Nasir. Go ahead, Nasir.
May I speak in Urdu or in English?
उर्दू में बोलिए.
I don't know if the Urdu translator is there to.
We are ready to translate. Nasir, if you want to proceed, please go ahead.
Okay, Nasir.
Farhan, this is a cue. Please switch your
मैं तो अब ये बात सिर्फ रखना चाह रहा हूँ कि ये जो आपका एक तो जो ये सर्वे हमने ये सारा रिपोर्ट बनाई है, इसमें जो ये इस किस्म की I think that is a first hand in जिसको हम इंडिया में और पाकिस्तान में कहते हैं फर्स्ट इंफॉर्मेशन रिपोर्ट है, जिसको FIR कहते हैं, हम थाने में दाखिल करवाते हैं. क्योंकि ये सारे जो क्राइसिस आया है कोरोना की वजह से, इसमें जो क्राइम कमिट हुआ है उस क्राइम के खिलाफ मैं समझता हूँ कि एक ही रिपोर्ट है. और तो इसमें हम ये देख सकते हैं कि ये ब्रांड्स ने किस तरीके से क्रिमिनल एक्ट्स किए हैं. और इन्होंने अपनी जो ये हमेशा कहते रहते थे कि हमारी सोशल कॉर्पोरेट रिस्पांसिबिलिटी है.
Sorry to interrupt, there is a request. Could you switch to Urdu channel? Then only we'll be able to function the translate. Russian channel, I'm sorry, Russian. Can you pick Russian on interpretation signal?
Yeah. Sure, yeah.
Great, go ahead. Thank you.
So मैं बहुत टू द पॉइंट्स बात रखना चाहता हूँ. इसकी वजह से पाकिस्तान में अराउंड 18 मिलियन वर्कर्स जो है वो उन्होंने अपने जो वेजेस को लॉस किया है, पार्शियली या टोटली. और हम ये देखते हैं कि इसमें सबसे ज्यादा जो सूरत हाल खराब हुई है वो टेक्सटाइल, गारमेंट और लेदर के वर्कर्स के साथ हुई है. और ये उन हालात में हुई है कि ये कोविड से पहले ही जो है जो टेक्सटाइल गारमेंट्स के अंदर लेस देन 1% वर्कर्स आर यूनियनाइज, और जबकि कलेक्टिव बार्गेनिंग जो है 0.5% यूनियंस के पास भी कलेक्टिव बार्गेनिंग नहीं है. तो इट वाज अ वर्स्ट कंडीशन. और जब ये कोविड आया, इसमें जो वर्कर्स के साथ सिचुएशन आई तो उनको बचाने के लिए कोई भी प्लांट लेवल की यूनियन मौजूद नहीं थी, और इसका ब्रांड्स ने भी फायदा उठाया और जो है लोकल सप्लायर्स हैं उन्होंने भी फायदा उठाया. पाकिस्तान के लॉज उसके अंदर काम नहीं आए. JFAs मौजूद थे जो इंडस्ट्रियल ग्लोबल यूनियन के साथ बड़े बड़े ब्रांड्स के साथ मौजूद हैं, वो कहीं काम पे नहीं आया. इस तरीके से GSP प्लस हमारे पास मौजूद था, वो कहीं मौजूद नहीं हुआ. और बदकिस्मती से ILO का पाकिस्तान के अंदर इस सारी सिचुएशन के अंदर हमें एज ए एक्टिव ट्रेड यूनियनिस्ट जो है हमें कहीं पे भी कोई रोल इसके अंदर नजर नहीं आया. और ये मैं समझता हूँ कि ये इस तरह की कुछ और रिसर्च भी हो रही है, लेकिन ये बहुत अच्छी बात है कि ये बहुत अभी पाकिस्तान के अंदर तीसरी लहर आई हुई है कोविड की, और इसके अंदर हम ये इसको पेश करने जा रहे हैं. और मुझे कहने में अब जो मेन बात है वो मैं ये समझता हूँ कि ये तमाम लॉज, नेशनल लॉज मौजूद होने के बावजूद, इंटरनेशनल लेबर स्टैंडर्ड्स के बावजूद, अगर ब्रांड्स जो हैं वो अपनी जो कमिटमेंट्स हैं उन पे पूरा नहीं उतरते तो उसके नए रास्ते तलाश करने की जरूरत है. और उसके लिए कोई मैंडेटरी और बाइंडिंग उनके ऊपर कोई ट्रीटीज का होना बहुत जरूरी है. अदरवाइज वो हमेशा बायलैटरल, ट्राइपार्टाइट्स और जो है जिसको आप कहते हैं नॉन बाइंडिंग्स एग्रीमेंट्स के अंदर बैठ के वो बहुत सारी कमिटमेंट करते हैं लेकिन उस पर पूरा नहीं उतरते. तो पाकिस्तान जैसा मुल्क जिसके अंदर टेक्सटाइल और गारमेंट्स तमाम बड़े दुनिया के ब्रांड्स यहाँ पर मौजूद हैं, लेकिन उनकी जो सूरत हाल है फैक्ट्रीज के, देयर आर वर्चुअली दे आर इन हम ये कह सकते हैं कि वो बॉन्डेड लेबर के तौर पे काम करते हैं. मैं ऐसी फैक्ट्रीज जो बड़े बड़े ब्रांड्स के लिए माल बनाती हैं.
थैंक्स नासिर.
या थैंक यू. हेलो.
Yeah, I think you have to start wrapping up, Nasir. Yeah, Oshim, go ahead.
Okay, Nasir, thanks for making that short presentation. I'm going to now go straight to Mora. Mora is the program coordinator of the Tarde, which is the Cambodian Union.
मोरा जो है वो प्रोग्राम मैनेजर है कंबोडियन यूनियन के.
Hindi interpreter, please go to your own channel.
The part of the it's a very woman-led union.
One second. Hindi interpreter, please stay in your channel. Go ahead, Oshim.
So over to you, Mora. Quickly give a short synoptical view of what's happening in Cambodia.
អរគុណSam ហើយសូមជំរាបសួរដល់សមាមិត្តមិត្តភ័ក្តិយើងទាំងអស់គ្នាដែលបានចូលរួមក្នុងកម្មវិធីរបស់យើងនៅថ្ងៃនេះ
Mora, I think you have to be in the Cambodia Khmer channel.
Yes, yeah, I'm already in Khmer channel.
Okay.
Do you hear me? Yeah. But សួស្តីម្ដងទៀតបងប្អូនអរគ្នាដំបូងខ្ញុំអរគុណសម្រាប់ឱកាសក្នុងការដែលបានចែកម្លែកពីស្ថានភាពនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជានៅក្នុងបរិបទនៃ COVID-19 ដែលយើងទៅអបអរបងប្អូនប្រទេសហើយជាទូទៅប្រទេសកម្ពុជាក៏ដូចជាប្រទេសដទៃដែរដែលយើងជួបផលប៉ះពាល់ក្នុងស្ថានភាពនេះ ហើយបើយើងមើលក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាយើងឃើញរូបចក្រមួយចំនួនបានព្យួរបានផ្អាកផលិតកម្មនិងមួយចំនួនទៀតបានបិទដែលស្ថានភាពនេះវាធ្វើឲ្យប៉ះពាល់ទៅដល់កម្មកររាប់ម៉ឺននាក់ដែលពួកគាត់ត្រូវបានព្យួរកិច្ចសន្យាការងារត្រូវបានបាត់បង់ប្រាក់ឈ្នួលបាត់បង់ការងាររបស់ពួកគាត់ហើយបើទោះជាពួកគាត់បាត់បង់ការងារឬក៏ការងារត្រូវព្យួរក៏ដោយប៉ុន្តែយើងឃើញថាការចំណាយទៅលើជីវភាពរស់នៅរបស់ពួកគាត់ហ្នឹងគឺថានៅតែដដែលហើយតែគាត់ត្រូវរ៉ាប់រងទៅលើការចំណាយប្រចាំថ្ងៃថ្លៃអាហារថ្លៃផ្ទះជួលទឹកភ្លើងជួយគាំទ្រទៅដល់ក្រុមគ្រួសាររបស់គាត់នៅតាមបណ្ដាខេត្តហើយជាពិសេសទៀតនោះគឺគាត់ត្រូវសងបំណុលធនាគារហើយដូចការដូចអ្នកដែលរាយការណ៍ពីការរកឃើញរបស់យើងនោះគឺថានៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជានោះកម្មករភាគច្រើនបានជាប់បំណុលរួចទៅហើយនៅក្នុងស្ថានភាព COVID-19 នេះវាធ្វើឲ្យពួកគាត់តែលំបាកថែមទៀតហើយបាទអញ្ចឹងនៅពេលដែលគាត់បាត់បង់ប្រាក់ចំណូលគឺធនាគារនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាហ្នឹងគឺมันបានព្យួរទេគឺថានៅតែបន្តតម្រូវឲ្យកម្មករហ្នឹងបន្តបង់លើបំណុលលុយបំណុលហើយចម្រិតថែមទៀតលើហ្នឹងហើយបើយើងមើលទៅការឆ្លើយតបរបស់រដ្ឋាភិបាលក៏ដូចជាភាគីនយោជកនៅក្នុងស្ថានភាពបែបហ្នឹងគឺវាមិនអាចគ្រប់គ្រាន់សម្រាប់តម្រូវការរបស់បងប្អូនកម្មករយោជកទេព្រោះរដ្ឋាភិបាលហ្នឹងបានគាំទ្រផ្ដល់ឲ្យត្រឹមតែ$40ហើយនិងនយោជកហ្នឹងផ្ដល់ឲ្យត្រឹមតែ$30ហើយសរុបទៅគឺចំនួន$70ដែលមានន័យថាជាការឧបត្ថម្ភដល់កម្មករដែលរងការព្យួរកិច្ចសន្យាការងារនៅកំឡុងពេលហ្នឹងអញ្ចឹងវាតិចតួចមែនទែនដែលវាមិនអាចឆ្លើយតបនឹងជីវភាពរស់នៅរបស់ពួកគាត់ឡើយហើយមួយវិញទៀតបើយើងក្រៅពីគាត់បាត់បង់ប្រាក់ចំណូលប្រឈមនឹងជីវភាពរស់នៅយើងឃើញថាស្ថានភាពនៃការរំលោភបំពានទៅលើសេរីភាពសហជីពសិទ្ធិកម្មករហ្នឹងគឺបន្តនៅមានការរំលោភបំពាននឹងដដែលហើយសហជីពថ្នាក់នាំសហជីពត្រូវបានប្រឈប់ហើយជាក់ស្ដែងគេត្រូវបានពួកគាត់ត្រូវបានមានន័យថានយោជកប្រើហេតុផលនៃការរំសាយកម្មករហើយយកលេសនៅក្នុងស្ថានភាពហ្នឹងប្រឈប់ថ្នាក់នាំសហជីពហើយបើយើងមើលពីការអន្តរាគមន៍បើយើងពីរដ្ឋាភិបាលវិញគឺមិនបានយកឱកាសហ្នឹងនៅក្នុងការជួយគាំទ្រតែជនងាយរងគ្រោះដូចជាកម្មករទេពេលផ្ទុយពីហ្នឹងគឺគាត់លំអៀងទៅខាងនយោជកហើយបំរើមានបំពេញចិត្តនយោជកជាជាងការពារការរំលោភសិទ្ធិរបស់កម្មករឬក៏ព្យាយាមអនុវត្តច្បាប់ដើម្បីកុំឲ្យមានការរំលោភសិទ្ធិរបស់កម្មករហើយជាក់ស្ដែងបើសិនជាករណីរបស់កម្មករយោជកត្រូវប្តឹងទៅក្រសួងការងារទៅលើរឿងករណីប្រឈប់ថ្នាក់នាំសហជីពជាដើមហ្នឹងគឺថាក្រសួងការងារត្រូវចាត់ទុកករណីនេះគឺជាវិវាទបុគ្គលដែលមិនមែនចាត់ដែលចាត់ទុកនឹងជាវិវាទរួមហើយ
Mora, if you can wrap up 1 more minute.
អបទៅលើរឿងហ្នឹងមិនបន្តទៅក្រុមប្រឹក្សាយ៉ាងដែរហើយបើយើងករណីទាំងអស់ហ្នឹងគឺជាបញ្ហាចម្បងសំខាន់នៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាបើយើងធ្វើកិច្ចការងារដើម្បីឲ្យមានការអន្តរាគមន៍ពីអ្នកប្រជាជនពីអីផ្សេងៗហ្នឹងគឺមិនជាមានប្រសិទ្ធភាពប្រមាណទេជាក់ស្ដែងយើងបានកទូខ្លួនឯងរួមជាមួយនឹង Flowway រួមជាមួយនឹង CCC ដើម្បីធ្វើការតាក់ទងទៅម្ចាស់ម៉ាកដើម្បីឲ្យមានការអន្តរាគមន៍ហ្នឹងហើយពេលច្រើនម្ចាស់ម៉ាកហ្នឹងតែងតែយកហេតុផលយលេសនៅក្នុងស្ថានភាព COVID-19 ហ្នឹងដើម្បីពជាពេលដើម្បីមិនដោះស្រាយបញ្ហារបស់កម្មករយោជកជាក់ស្ដែងដល់ឥឡូវនេះវាជាង2ឆ្នាំហើយកម្មករឬក៏ថ្នាក់នាំសហជីពកទូនេះនៅតែមិនទាន់បានចូលធ្វើការហើយខ្ញុំគិតថាក្នុងឱកាសហ្នឹងខ្ញុំសូមស្នើទៅដល់ម្ចាស់ម៉ាកឲ្យមានការទទួលខុសត្រូវទាំងធានាបាននៅប្រាក់ឈ្នួល ក៏ដូចជាអត្ថប្រយោជន៍ជាផ្សេងទៀតនេះគឺសេរីភាពរបស់កម្មករនិយោជិតនៅក្នុងស្ថានភាពនេះតែម្ដងបាទសូមអរគុណ Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Maura. We will straight away move to Rukmini. She's from India and she's a president of Government Labour Union based in Bangalore. So Rukmini. Rukmini, are you there?
While we wait for Rukmini, I just want to let the audience know. Interpreters, please
switch back to your channel. You're on English right now.
As Rukmini is coming on, she's the last trade unionist. After that, we go to the academics panel.
We have Abul still there.
Oh, Rukmini and Abul. Okay. Rukmini, are you there?
Can we move to Abul first?
Rukmini, you need to unmute yourself. You're on. Yeah, thank you.
Please, Rukmini, can you be fast? Hello.
Hello.
What's happening?
Go ahead, Rukmini.
ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ನಾನು ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಸಿಚುವೇಶನ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ. ಇವಾಗ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ 2020 ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು ಆಗಿದೆ. ಮೇಯ್ನ್ ಆಗಿ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಂಗ್ ಒಂದು ಕಂಪ್ಲೇಂಟ್ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಪ್ರೆಗ್ನೆಂಟ್ ವುಮೆನ್ದು. ಪ್ರೆಗ್ನೆಂಟ್ ವುಮೆನ್ ಹೋಗ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ರಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಪ್ರೆಗ್ನೆಂಟ್ ಆಗಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಅಂತ ಇನ್ಫಾರ್ಮ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ESI ಬೆನಿಫಿಟ್ ಸಿಗ್ಬೇಕಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ. ಅದಾಗಿದ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಮ್ಯಾನೇಜ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಇಮಿಡಿಯೇಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಅವರು ಪ್ರೆಗ್ನೆಂಟ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ ತಕ್ಷಣನೇ ಇಮಿಡಿಯೇಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಫೋರ್ಸಬಲಿ ರಿಸೈನ್ ಮಾಡಿಸಿದ್ರು. ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅವರು ನಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಕಂಪ್ಲೇಂಟ್ ನ ತಂದ್ರು. ತಂದಾದ್ಮೇಲೆ ನಾವು ಸುಮಾರು ಮ್ಯಾನೇಜ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಜೊತೆ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡಿ ಪ್ರೆಸರ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ವಾಪಸ್ಸು ಕೆಲ್ಸಕ್ಕೆ ತಗೊಂಡ್ರು. ಇದು ಅವ್ರೊಬ್ರು ಸ್ಟೋರಿ ಅಲ್ಲ. ತುಂಬಾ ಜನ ಹೆಣ್ಮಕ್ಳು ಪ್ರೆಗ್ನೆಂಟ್ ವುಮೆನ್ 2020-21 ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಕಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. ತುಂಬಾ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳನ್ನ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಏನು ಕ್ರಶ್ ಓಪನ್ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಸ್ಟಿಲ್ ಇಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೆ ಕ್ರಶ್ ಓಪನ್ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಮಕ್ಳುಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡ್ಕೊಳಕ್ಕೆ ತುಂಬಾ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಜೀವನ ಮಾಡ್ಲೇಬೇಕು, ಕೆಲಸದ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇದೆ. ಹಂಗಾಗಿ ತುಂಬಾನೇ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರಿಗೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದ್ ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಪೋರ್ಟ್ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆನ ಕಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಪೂರ್ತಿಯಾಗಿ. ವರ್ಕರ್ ಸ್ಯಾಲರಿಯಿಂದ ಡಿಡಕ್ಷನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಅಟೆಂಡೆನ್ಸ್ ಬೋನಸ್ ಸಿಗ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ.
We have a problem with the interpretation. Can we?
No, we can hear you, but I think Rukmini's internet is weak. So I think we will move to. Okay, can you briefly summarize what she was going to say?
ನನ್ನ ನೆಟ್ವರ್ಕ್ ಇಶ್ಯೂ ಇದೆ, ಮನೆಯಿಂದ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರೋದ್ರಿಂದ. ಸೊ ಈ ತರದೆಲ್ಲ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳನ್ನ ಗಾರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ವರ್ಕರ್ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕ್ರೀಚ್ ಕೂಡ ಓಪನ್ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಪೋರ್ಟ್ ವರ್ಕರ್ದು ಇಂದಾನೇ ಕಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಹಂಗಾಗಿ ವರ್ಕರ್ ತುಂಬಾ ಜನ ರಿಸೈನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಜಾಬ್ ನ ಕಳ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ಸಾಧ್ಯತೆಗಳು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಇತ್ತು. ರಿಸೈನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, PF ತಗೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಇವಾಗ ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಇವಾಗ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಮಾರು ತಮಿಳ್ನಾಡಲ್ಲಿ ವ್ಯಾಕ್ಸಿನೇಷನ್ಗೆ ಏನು ಅಮೌಂಟ್ ನ ಕಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ವರ್ಕರ್ಸ್ಗೆ ಈ ಲಾಕ್ಡೌನ್ ವೇಜಸ್ ₹1 ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ ತಮಿಳ್ನಾಡಲ್ಲಿ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು 50% ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ, 50% ವೇಜಸ್ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. ತುಂಬಾ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ಗಳನ್ನ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಟಾರ್ಗೆಟ್ ಮಾಡುವಂಥದ್ದು, ಯೂನಿಯನ್ ಮೆಂಬರ್ನ ಟಾರ್ಗೆಟ್ ಮಾಡುವಂಥದ್ದು, ಈ ತರದೆಲ್ಲ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳು ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಾವು ಈಗ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು CCC ಇಂದನೂ ನಾವು ಈ ವೇಜ್ ಇದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ. ಸೆವೆರಲ್ ಗ್ಯಾರಂಟಿ ಫಂಡ್ ನ ಇಡಬೇಕು ಈ ತರ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಸಿಚುವೇಶನ್ ಬಂದಾಗ, ಮತ್ತೆ ವೇಜ್ ಅಸೂರೆನ್ಸ್ ನ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ನಾವು ಕೂಡ CCC ಮೆಂಬರ್ ಕೂಡ ಆಗಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ 200 ಮೆಂಬರ್ ಸಿಗ್ನೇಚರ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಈ ತರದ್ದು ಒಂದು ಟ್ರಾಜಿಡಿ ಆದಾಗ ವರ್ಕರ್ಸ್ಗೆ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಒಂದು ಭದ್ರತೆ ಇರ್ಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ತುಂಬಾ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳನ್ನ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದಾರೆ ವರ್ಕರ್, ಕೆಲಸ ಕಳ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಮತ್ತೆ ಸರ್ವಿಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ಮಿಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಈ ತರದ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳನ್ನ ಸಿಕ್ಕಾಪಟ್ಟೆ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಮತ್ತೆ ಬ್ರಾಂಡ್ಗಳು ಮೇಯ್ನ್ ಆಗಿ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಗಳನ್ನ ತಗೋಬೇಕು. ಅವರು ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯಿಂದ ನುಣ್ಚ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋ ಅಂತ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಯಾವುದೇ ಒಂದು ಇಷ್ಟೊಂದೆಲ್ಲ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆಗಳನ್ನ ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರು ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಫೇಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ರು ಕೂಡ ಬ್ರಾಂಡ್ ಅವರು ಕಿವಿ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ದೇ ಇರೋ ತರ ಆರಾಮಾಗಿ ಅವ್ರ ಲಾಭ ಎಷ್ಟು ಅಷ್ಟು ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಆರಾಮಾಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇದು ತುಂಬಾ ಸಮಸ್ಯೆ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಸಪ್ಲೈಯರು, ಬ್ರಾಂಡು, ಸರ್ಕಾರ ಯಾವುದೇ ತರದ್ದು ಕಾರ್ಮಿಕರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಗಳನ್ನ ತಗೊಳ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೇಯ್ನ್ ಆಗಿ ಬ್ರಾಂಡ್ಗಳು ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಗಳನ್ನ ತಗೋಬೇಕು. ತುಂಬಾ ಇದನ್ನ ಪ್ಲೇ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದಾರೆ, ಗೇಮ್ ಪ್ಲೇನ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು ಬ್ರಾಂಡ್ಗಳು. ಮೇಯ್ನ್ ಆಗಿ ಬ್ರಾಂಡ್ಗಳ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿ ತಗೋಬೇಕು ಈ ಒಂದು ಸಿಚುವೇಶನ್ಗೆ. ಧನ್ಯವಾದಗಳು.
Thank you, Rukmini. Sorry for rushing you. Abul Hussain from Bangladesh, who's actually the president of the Textile and Garment Workers Federation, and also a large coalition member of a bigger confederation of the trade unions there. So, Abul bhai, make it short, please. And you have only 3 minutes. Yes, Abul bhai.
Okay, আমাকে শুনতে পাচ্ছেন আপনারা?
হ্যাঁ, শুনতে পাই। আপনি বলুন, শুরু করুন বাংলাতে।
But Abul, if you're please choose Bangla, please choose Bangla as the language in your interpretation icon. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, Abul, are you there?
Hello. Bangladesh, we can't hear it.
Abul, are you, is your,
Even the Bangla channel is not working. Sorry. We should be. Hello.
Abul is on mute. He needs to unmute himself.
Okay.
Abul, can you unmute?
Yes. শুনতে পাচ্ছেন?
Yes, please go ahead.
আমার বক্তব্য শুরুতেই এশিয়ান ফ্লোরাইস এয়ারলাইন্সকে ধন্যবাদ জানাই যে তারা একটা খুবই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ কাজ সমাপ্ত করেছেন। 6টি দেশের উপরে এই ধরনের কাজ সম্ভবত এই প্রথম এশিয়ান এয়ারলাইন্সের।
Where is the 1 minute? Where is the translator for Abul?
Abul needs to be in Bangla channel. He's not in Bangla.
Yeah, Abul, can you please choose Bangla channel?
He's in Bangla channel.
No, he's in the English.
Bangla channel there.
Go ahead.
Bangla channel.
বলো।
ওকে,
শেষ করে দাও তোমার কথা।
এই জন্য আমি এশিয়ান ফ্লোরাইসকে ধন্যবাদ জানাই এবং এই সুযোগে আমরা 6টি দেশের শ্রমিক নেতারা একত্র হতে পেরেছি। এই জন্য এশিয়ান ফ্লোরাইসকে আন্তরিক ধন্যবাদ জানাই। তো এই কাজটি করতে গিয়ে আমাদের যে সমস্যা,
Abul, we will not be able to translate you unless you are on the Bangla channel.
Bangla channel.
Ashim, please.
Where is Bangla channel?
He is on the Bangla.
No, he's.
Where is he?
Abul, can you see a globe-like symbol at the bottom of your screen?
Yes.
Please choose Bangla in that. Otherwise, we will have to move on. The Bangla channel.
Where is your Bangla channel?
Hello. তুমি বলো কথা বাংলাতে বলো, I will English translate it immediately.
ওকে, তো হ্যাঁ যেটা আমি বলছিলাম, তো এই কাজটি হ্যালো,
Yes, go ahead, go ahead.
আমি বলবো?
হ্যাঁ বলো।
হ্যাঁ, এই কাজটি করতে গিয়ে আমাদের যে অভিজ্ঞতা হয়েছে সেটা সংক্ষিপ্তভাবে আপনাদের সামনে তুলে ধরছি। প্রথমত এই কাজটি করার সময় আমরা নানা রকম প্রতিবন্ধকতার সম্মুখীন হয়েছি, বিশেষ করে সরকারের বিভিন্ন এজেন্সি এবং মালিকদের পক্ষ থেকে। আমাদের মাঠ পর্যায়ে দুজন কর্মীকে নাজেহাল করেছেন, ফলে আমরা উপর থেকে চাপ প্রয়োগ করে তাদেরকে আমরা মুক্ত করেছি। এটা আমাদের একটা বড় তিক্ত অভিজ্ঞতা হয়েছে এই কাজটি করার জন্য। আর এই কাজের সময় আমরা যা লক্ষ্য করেছি সেটা হচ্ছে যে আমাদের এই কোভিড প্যান্ডামিকের সময় আমাদের শ্রমিকদের নানা রকম হয়রানি, নির্যাতন এবং মজুরি বৈষম্যের শিকার হতে হয়েছে। বিশেষ করে আমাদের শিল্প এলাকা, গার্মেন্টস শিল্প এলাকা, সাভার, টঙ্গী, গাজীপুর, এগুলো হচ্ছে বড় বড় শিল্প এলাকা যেখানে বড় বড় ফ্যাক্টরি রয়েছেন। আমরা মূলত এই তিনটি এলাকায় এই কাজটা করেছি। আমরা বাংলাদেশের দুইটি শ্রমিক সংগঠন, আমাদের টেক্সটাইল গার্মেন্টস ওয়ার্কার্স ফেডারেশন এবং গার্মেন্টস ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন সেন্টার, এই দুইটি সংগঠন মিলে এই কাজটা আমরা করেছি। তবে আমাদের অভিজ্ঞতা হচ্ছে যে এই কাজটা করার সময় যে আমাদের আশুলিয়াতে একটি কারখানার শ্রমিকদের বেতন না দেওয়ার অজুহাতে আমাদের দুইজন যখন শ্রমিকরা নেতারা আন্দোলন করছিল, সেই নেতাদের নামে মিথ্যা মামলা দিয়ে 13 জন শ্রমিক নেতার বিরুদ্ধে মামলা দিয়ে 6 জনকে গ্রেপ্তার করে তাদেরকে কারাবন্দী করে রেখেছিলেন গত ঈদুল ফিতরের সময়। পরবর্তীতে আমরা তাদেরকে মুক্ত করি। এবং আরেকটি কারখানায় ঈদের সময়ে মজুরি না দেওয়ার কারণে শ্রমিক আন্দোলন করে, সেই আন্দোলনের সময় শ্রমিকদের নামে মামলা দায়ের করা হয় এবং মামলা দিয়ে 204 জন শ্রমিকের নামমাত্র বেতন ভাতা দিয়ে তাদেরকে ফায়ার করা হয়, কারখানা থেকে বের করে দেওয়া হয়। এটা আমাদের একটা তিক্ত অভিজ্ঞতা। আর এই কোভিডকালীন সময়ে আমাদের মালিকদের পক্ষ থেকে, বিশেষ করে বিজিএমই পক্ষ থেকে সরকারের কাছে দাবি করা হয়েছিল যে আমাদের শ্রম আইনের বিশেষ ধারাগুলো, যেখানে শিল্প সম্পর্ক রয়েছে, এই ধারাগুলো স্থগিত রাখার জন্য তারা বারবার সরকারের কাছে চাপ দিয়ে আসছিল, কিন্তু সরকার তাদের চাপের কাছে মাথা নত করেনি। তারা আমাদের সেই কাজটি তারা করেনি। এর জন্য আমরা সরকারকে ধন্যবাদ জানাই। তৃতীয়ত হচ্ছে যে আমরা লক্ষ্য করেছি যে যখনই কোনো কারখানায় ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন করতে যায়, সেইটা কারখানার শ্রমিকদেরকে নানাভাবে হয়রানি করা হয়, তাদেরকে চাকরিচ্যুত করা হয়, তাদেরকে জেল জুলুম করা হয় এবং অবশেষে ইউনিয়নটাকে ধ্বংস করা হয়। অর্থাৎ ইউনিয়ন বাস্টিং এর একটা বড় উদাহরণ হচ্ছে আমাদের বাংলাদেশ। 4 নম্বর বিষয়টি হচ্ছে যে আমাদের এই কোভিডকালীন সময়ে সবকিছু শাটডাউন করা হয়েছে। এখন বর্তমানে বাংলাদেশে শাটডাউন চলছে। তো এই শাটডাউনের মধ্যে সমস্ত কিছু বন্ধ থাকার পরেও গার্মেন্টস শিল্প চালু আছে এবং সেখানে শ্রমিকরা যাচ্ছে, কিন্তু শ্রমিকদের প্রয়োজনীয় স্বাস্থ্য সুরক্ষা সামগ্রী এবং তাদের ভ্যাকসিন এর আওতায় আনা হয়নি। এখন সর্বশেষ সরকার যে নীতি করেছে তাতে বলা হয়েছে যে 35 বছর ঊর্ধ্ব তাদেরকে ভ্যাকসিনের আওতায় আনা হবে। কিন্তু আপনারা জানেন যে আমাদের পোশাক শিল্পের শ্রমিকদের গড় বয়স হচ্ছে 19। তো দেখা যাবে যে এই শ্রমিকরা এই ভ্যাকসিনের আওতায় আসবে না।
আবুল ভাই 1 মিনিট।
জি
বলো, 1 মিনিট আছে শুধু।
ওকে, তারপর যেটা বলতে চাই যে সেটা হচ্ছে যে সরকার যে করোনার সময় শ্রমিক সরকারকে মালিকদেরকে প্রণোদনা দিয়েছেন, কিন্তু শ্রমিকদেরকে এখন পর্যন্ত কোনো প্রণোদনা দেয়নি। ইভেন কি সরকারের এই কোভিড চলাকালীন সময়ে শ্রমিকদের যে আর্থিক সংকট হয়েছে সেই সংকট সমাধানের জন্য সরকার কোনো সহায়তা দেয়নি। এবং এই কোভিড শেষ সময় প্রায় 2 থেকে 2.5 লক্ষ শ্রমিক কর্মচ্যুত কর্মহারা হয়েছেন। তারা এখন মানবতার জীবন যাপন করছেন, তারা অনাহারে রয়েছেন, কিন্তু সেই অনাহারী শ্রমিকদেরকে কোনো রকম সরকারি সাহায্য করেনি। তো ফলে আমরা ট্রেড ইউনিয়নের পক্ষ থেকে যতটা পারছি আমরা বিভিন্ন জায়গা থেকে কিছু খাদ্য সামগ্রী সরবরাহ করে তাদেরকে দেওয়ার চেষ্টা করেছি, কিন্তু এটা তো বুঝতেই পারেন এত বড় সেক্টরের জন্য সামান্য খুবই কম। তো এই কথা বলে আপনাদের সবাইকে ধন্যবাদ জানিয়ে আমি আমার বক্তব্য শেষ করছি বাংলাদেশের পক্ষ থেকে।
But the garment workers were doubly affected by the massive floods in the last year. So that's an added thing that happened. So without taking any further, no question answer, we will move to Dave, who will take over the session and will moderate the session with all the senior and very eminent academics who are part of this panel to discuss this report. Okay, Dave.
Thank you, Ashim, for moderating the trade union panel, which is a big challenge for us with so many languages going on. And we thank the audience for your patience. We are running behind time, but we are committed to bringing trade unions to the global platform, no matter the challenges. So please bear with us. And the program will run a few more minutes longer because we have a hugely exciting academic panel, and I think you are dying to hear them. And we also want to have some discussion. So I hope you will bear with us and stay with us a little bit later because we'll surely run late. I would like to introduce the moderator of the next panel, Dev Nathan, who is a very engaged academic with a deep interest and commitment to the world of labor and social movements. He is globally known for his scholarship in global value chains. He is the visiting professor at Institute for Human Development in India and co-editor of the Cambridge University Press series on global value chains. Dev, please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to Ananya and the Asia Floor Wage. We are a little over time, as everybody can see and hear. So we have, as Ananya has mentioned, a very distinguished panel. We have Gary Gerafi, who is professor at the Duke University and also the founder of the GVC Center there. He has done many of the foundational works on the analysis of global value chains, and he will be our first speaker. Gary, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Dev, and thanks so much to the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, not only for carrying out the study, but also for bringing the voice of the trade union participants to speak directly on the issues in their countries. So I think that I first want to congratulate the group that has organized this kind of a study, because it is extremely difficult, but also very important to have the kind of cross-national factory level findings of the hundreds and thousands of workers that you have been interviewing. So I think it's a landmark project, and dealing with the 6 countries, almost 200 factories. So congratulations from my perspective. I think this paradigm of global value chains or global production networks that you're using is well suited to try to bridge the global structures that you're describing in the apparel value chain with these local realities that you're seeing in all of the different countries. And I think that the purpose of the framework, when it was first created over 20 years ago, was precisely to bring these kinds of results to the attention of governments, policymakers, companies, workers themselves, and other groups that might be able to help. So I think the framework is a good one. 2 of the other speakers we're going to have a lot of experience with this kind of work. Stephanie Barrientos, who you'll hear from shortly, has done another study of this sort where we were looking, it's called Capturing the Gains, looking at economic and social upgrading in global value chains, looking at 4 industries. Apparel was one, very important one. And in the Cambridge University Press book series that Dev is, and Stephanie and I are helping to co-edit, there are a number of important studies that relate to this. A book on sweatshops, Stephanie's book on gender and work, and several books on labor in Asia, and some new books on monopsony capitalism. So Dev, maybe later you can send a link to the book series. So in the few minutes that are left, I wanted to just, I think, address the fundamental challenge that your study is raising, which is the asymmetric power relations in this apparel industry, where the branded companies have disproportionate influence compared to the actual garment makers and the workers in that industry. I think the summary of your study that was done at the very beginning of this session did an excellent job of outlining the management practices of the brands that contribute to the kind of labor exploitation and abuses that have been documented, not only in the report, but in the presentations by some of the trade union members earlier. As an academic, I think there are several findings of your report that are globally important, and you should continue to highlight. One of them was this finding that 74% of workers' wages in the countries you studied were below the poverty line. And that's a general kind of a problem, but you also have highlighted how COVID-19 and the disruptions of the COVID pandemic have introduced additional problems where a large percentage of workers have lost many days of wages. I think you were saying at least 60 days or more in many of the cases, and that the living wage, and something very important you've calculated in your study, that the living wage for apparel workers would be at least 3 times the prevailing minimum wage. So I think your study is highlighting some longer term problems in the apparel industry in terms of the asymmetric power structures and short term problems connected to COVID-19. So in the last couple of minutes, to me, the question you're all addressing is how to change this. I mean, this is a very big set of problems. I think the Bangladesh case has been particularly well publicized in some recent studies because Bangladesh has emerged as the #2 apparel exporter worldwide. And a series of very detailed reports like yours and other work by Mark Anner and other colleagues have shown very, very graphically how the companies in Bangladesh actually engaged in a number of very bad business practices in terms of stopping their orders once the pandemic hit. And it was only through a lot of pressure that different groups of companies began to change some of the initial bad practices. So to me, the 4 areas of work that are relevant: 1, widely disseminating the findings and the scope of this study. This conference is a start in doing that, and I'm sure there'll be many other mechanisms. A second way forward, continue to pressure national governments, but also the International Labor Organization to condemn the situations that have occurred in terms of the bad practices, labor abuses, and unpaid wages, lost days of work. All of that I think governments and the ILO are in some position to exert pressure. But I think one of the most important things that your study allows you to do is, because you are identifying particular companies in particular countries and what their practices are, you can actually, I think, exert pressure or leverage on the companies that are the leading brands and some of the manufacturers. One way to do that is companies that do step up and change their practices. Those companies can actually be identified, and it helps their reputation. Similarly, companies that are not doing their part, the kind of naming and shaming of specific companies often really affects reputations of the brands. And that's one of the main levers you have. And then the final point is just that direct action by the workers and the unions that you've been describing and we heard a little bit about, ultimately is probably the most important on the ground action that can occur. But as we've heard, it's dangerous and difficult to do that. So hopefully using all these different levels, disseminating the report, pressuring governments in the ILO, using bargaining power against specific companies, and supporting the workers' activities will all, I think, stem from this incredibly valuable project. So I thank you for carrying it out, and I'll stop at that point.
Thanks, Gary. That was very useful, particularly the way you stress we have to think of how to go forward. What is a way for transformative change rather than the kind of incremental changes we've had? And we need to do something at an international level. As you said, what is the base of these bad practices? And we need to give it a kind of structure, a name. Global value chains is a structure that shows how these bad practices we need to go ahead from that. And also, as mentioned, some of the recent works are using the term monopsony capitalism. Now, the translators will be able to translate monopsony, but it's the other side of monopoly. Monopoly is where there is a few sellers and many buyers. But monopsony is where there are very few buyers, who we call the contracted brands, and there are many, many sellers. Many sellers as suppliers, and also workers who work for the supplying factories. So we're really having something that we should be calling global monopsony capitalism. This is a term that perhaps we can begin to use and is coming up in some discussions. Well, we have 3 more participants in this discussion. We'll take them in this order: Shahram Azhar first, then Ratna Saptari, and then Stephanie Barrientos. So we'll go next to Shahram. He is a professor of economics at Bucknell University. He's from Pakistan. He works on political economy and development economics. Besides his economics, the interesting thing, he was the founder and the ex-lead singer of Lal Band. Lal, as you know, those who don't know, Lal means red. So he was the leader of the Red Band. So maybe he still continues to sing. I don't know that, but Shahram is next, please.
Thank you, Dev. I just want to start by thanking the Asia Floor Wage Alliance for inviting me to this discussion, and more broadly for putting this remarkable report together. For me, the report provides a befitting criticism of global capitalism on the one hand, and its ideological and political apologists, the mainstream economist, the neoliberal institutions, and the official developmentalist narrative more generally. You know, the kinds of individuals who have been arguing that participation in global value chains is somehow going to be a panacea for underdevelopment in the global south. So I want to focus in particular on the central theme, the central concept, if you like, for which I would like to congratulate the authors of this particular report for calling a spade and referring to their findings in this particular report as wage theft. As I read through this report, I couldn't help but think that what this report has discovered within a very concrete temporal context, the context of the COVID pandemic, of course, is, as a matter of fact, a manifestation of a generality, a general law, if you like, that exists and has always existed in global capitalism, namely that what owners of capital have called profit is always a social theft of value produced by workers, a value that workers produce but never receive. That capitalism is at its core a system based on unpaid labor or wage theft. This is what Marx and Marxian economists since him have very, very specifically called class exploitation. Now, while the degree of class exploitation can and does vary both within and across countries, one of the major themes that this particular report has discovered is that we see a remarkably sharp degree of similarity in the experiences of the working class. So from my perspective, it would be interesting to ask how we as academics and theoreticians, etc., can make sense of the empirical evidence that Afwah has collected and demonstrated. Because let's not forget the story we are given by the proponents of the famed smile curve, the curve that plots the distance from the consumer on the x-axis and, quote unquote, contributions to value on the y-axis. Their argument, for those of you who don't know, is that the greatest contributions to the value of any product, garments in this case, occurs either at the pre or the post-production stage, i.e. in the world of finance or in the world of retail. And no prizes for guessing, their argument is that the lowest contributions to value, we are told, take place at the stage of manufacturing, hence the smile curve. In other words, the mainstream GVC proponents do not and have not distinguished between value received versus value produced, which makes them unable to explain a number of key facts that are that the reports such as this have revealed. So owing to the paucity of time, I'm just going to quickly describe the three broader or systemic frameworks that, in my view, can enable us to grasp the significance of the results of this report quickly. First, Samir Amin's famous law of global value or imperialist rent. Second, Wallerstein's emphasis on core versus peripheral production. And third, Baron and Sweezy's monopoly capitalism, or as they was arguing, a better approximation for today's global supply chains could be monopsony capitalism. I want to emphasize this. It's crucial to understand the key difference between these three approaches and the mainstream GVC literature. In these approaches, in these radical heterodox approaches, an analysis of accumulation cannot be restricted to national economies. Rather, the existence of national economies implies that they play different roles in global accumulation. As Samir Amin had pointed out 20, 30 years ago, the relations between advanced capitalist economies and the poorer economies of the world and the workers who live there is to understand how these relationships of production, distribution, exchange, etc., impact value transfers between these two worlds. This is what Samir Amin called the essence of the problem of accumulation on a world scale. Remember that Samir Amin and Wallerstein argued that it is more important to think in terms of core and peripheral production processes rather than this simplistic North versus South dichotomy. This is because, for those of you who don't know, Samir Amin and Wallerstein argued that core-like production processes are more akin to monopoly, with prices far exceeding marginal costs, while peripheral production processes are more akin to competitive production, where conditions of normal or average profit exist. And as we have seen in this report, this kind of an arrangement allows capital to extract surpluses through class, gender, as well as national exploitation via unequal exchange, imperialist rents, etc. Finally, and in conclusion, I feel that to understand the findings of this report, one has to theoretically appreciate the link between the monopsony power of these top brands and the inverse link that that power has with the wage share of workers in the global South. As Samir Amin, following Kaleski before him, had demonstrated, the rate of profit enjoyed by these top garment brands depends critically on two things. Firstly, the degree of monopsony power, and secondly, and most crucially, the bargaining power of these workers. So it's seen from this particular light, and I'm going to conclude with this, it is fairly simple to see then, as this report points out, that the COVID pandemic or any other crisis leads to a severe decline in the bargaining power, in this particular case of Asian workers. Hence, in every country, as this report shows, more and more workers have fallen below the poverty line. Nearly all the workers surveyed have reported falling into debt. Women and migrant workers are the worst affected in every country. So let me ask you this question. What does this say about a system that preys on the weakest members of our global community? Just one final point. The most distressing aspect of this story is that all of this, the wage theft and the humanitarian crisis that this report so aptly documents, all of this is legal. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that without moving in a systematic way towards the kinds of cross-border solidarity between workers that organizations such as AFWA are struggling for, and then using and building on those alliances to build solidarity across workers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and in particular, without fighting for a world in which the liability, the burden of losses in crises is not simply offloaded onto the weakest and poorest members of our global community, but at least some of the load is also lifted by those who benefit the most from such an arrangement. And I think that this report is a great first step in that particular direction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just reiterate what Gary and Sharam have said. This is a very robust report because it allows us to compare between countries, across countries. Otherwise we get a lot of data and we can't really compare them because people have used different methods for their calculation. But you have used one common method, which is consistently done all through the 6 countries of the study. So it will really make it a very important report because of its comparability. Well, our next speaker is Ratna Saptari. Ratna again has Sharam also has a double identity. She is an assistant professor from Indonesia. She is an assistant professor at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, but she is also General Secretary of the Indonesia Migrant Workers Union. So she combines her academic work with very consistent work in labor and Indonesian worker politics right from the time of the Suharto regime. Ratna?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the AFWA for this occasion of bringing us together, trade unionists and academics and activists. And I think that's a very, very significant event. So the previous academics have talked about the global value chains and the global dynamics and its effect on workers and representing processes of wage theft. What I would like to look at is a bit slightly different approach, is more about the different layers of power relations within these companies. That has been the research project of the AFWA. And this is, I find, a very valuable piece of research where one can definitely see the multi-level forms of corporate and state governance and power regimes, which workers have to deal with and strategize both individually and collectively. We can clearly see the diversity of worker status in the factories based on gender, employment status, and place of origin. It provides a highly important contribution to our understanding of social and economic differentiation and its implication on workers' politics. What I would like to focus on are these multi-layered forms of labor regimes that affect the nature of labor relations, but also the spaces of resistance. So, of course, this whole situation has brought for the precarious workers totally critical situation, but also I want to see them workers as having the agency, but also the spaces for resistance. Although whether it succeeds or not, we have to see, but I'm looking at also the various dynamics that occurs and shown by the report. So 3 levels that I would like to look at is first of all, locality and the community level politics. And secondly, the factory level dynamics. And the third is, which is also, we should not forget, very important, even for workplace politics, is about family, the family dynamics of these workers. How do all these factors affect workers' agency and resistance? These all influence spaces for resistance, taking into account their position in different tiers of production and state policies. So the first one is about locality and community level politics. In the last few decades, much has been written on the effects of flexible specialization and post-Fordist processes, where the decentralization of the process of production by firms is an attempt to adapt to market fluctuations. Collins refers to a multi-stranded relationship between the company and the workers' community. Here we have to take into account also the role of village leaders, the community leaders, which are incorporated in the company policy in creating spaces of consent. Yeah. But also these community leaders in certain situations play also a potential role in organizing against company policy. So we shouldn't see it as, a general situation where community leaders are also tools of the companies, but sometimes they are also organizing against company policies. As I borrowed Borroway's concept of manufacturing consent because quite often labor relations are not only seen as processes of coercion, but also of consent. How do workers actually comply to the labor situation where quite often wages are not paid or wages are not even fulfilling the minimum wage, etc. So its consent is not just about they don't have any choice, but also it's a choice to concede to the company strategies or politics. But the report shows, interestingly, the different backgrounds of the workers. Yeah, here, for instance, is shown India, 63% are migrants. Cambodia, 67% are migrants. But Pakistan, 75% are non-migrants. Yeah, and so you see, for instance, this type of different positions of the workers, migrants and non-migrants. How does that actually involve also processes of inclusion and exclusion. And so this all very, very strongly affects the solidarity among workers, or even the exclusion among workers themselves, and how the company takes advantage of these differences among workers. So the second point is the factory level. The factory level manufacturing consent, the assumption that labor relations are based on coercion alone, does not take into account the various ways in which workers' consent are obtained by factory management. Yeah. So this is often placed under the concept of corporate paternalism. And of course, in the pandemic period, this is often not part of the policy, but in general, corporate paternalism is often part of company politics to provide workers' consent. The clear standardized forms of organization and control are closely integrated with more cultural forms of manufacturing consent, involving attempts to create a pleasant working climate, which may reduce internal tensions, but mainly to reduce possibilities of resistance by the workers. So within factories, hierarchies are established based on gender, on age, on ethnicity, as well as different wage statuses. And in the report, it is shown that although we understand that garment industry is usually majority female workers, but here in this case, I see a difference. For instance, Pakistan has 86% male workers. So this is a very interesting point in which what does it imply for, say, solidarity or for control, et cetera, when more workers are male or female, et cetera. Also, what can be seen is the worker status. You have permanent workers, you have contract workers, you have regular workers. Here I see also Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia. They all have different categories of workers. So how does that influence the relationship with the company, with capital? Yeah. To what extent does it influence also their ability to resist, or to concede, or to consent to company policy? So these differences I would like to underline so that we can understand more the diversities in labor control and also in labor protests. And it is through these different wage statuses or wage pattern allocations that control of workers over workers, workers over workers, directly or indirectly is secured. So how does the intersection between worker status in the factory, migration background, and gender shape labor relations in the factory? So these are just aspects within the report which makes me, raise these questions also for reflection in moving forward. And the third component is the family level. Most conventional studies on labor relations view workplace as the main source of labor relations. Majority of the workforce are women, but we must also take into account interaction between the place of work and their families. It has been argued strongly that however, that there is no straightforward relation between income earned and increased power and authority within the household. As shown in the Indonesian case, for instance, earnings from the husband and wife are differently used within the household. Where, for instance, one example was this husband who pays only for children's education, whereas the wife pays for consumption and living expenses of aged mother and 2 children, and the husband left the wife. These kind of situations we often forget when we talk about labor relations. So having looked at these 3 levels, the next point is about workers' agency and resistance. How does the diversity of workers' background color workers' consciousness and resistance towards capital? And so labor movements have separated quite often the workplace from the home environment. Most labor benefits tend to directly affect the worker in the workplace. Yeah, but we also have to see what does this mean for women workers who have to deal with child rearing, with education, with health care and marriage. And quite often this is not just the relationship between the company and the worker, but also between husband and wife within the family. So I just want to bring up some challenging questions in dealing with corporations and how they subordinate the workers, but that we also have to see the different contexts, the interactional settings, but also the multi-layered forms of control and how there is, what kind of space is available for workers to deal with that. So, and this calls also for the shift in the study of everyday resistance to capture the construction of multiple and shifting identities of agents of resistance and the interplay between the strategy of the company and the strategy of workers. I think that's about it.
Thank you. Thank you. It was interesting to see how you brought in intersectionality and manufacturing consent all into it, the analysis of not just the workplace, but also the household. Thank you. So next we go to Stephanie Barrientos. She is the Emeritus Professor at the Global Development Institute of the University of Manchester. She led the research project that Gary referred to called Capturing the Gains, which very much put in at the center the question of who gets the gains, who captures the gains from global value chains. Much of her recent work has been on gender issues in global value chains, including the book Gender and Work in Global Value Chains, which was mentioned for the prize in 2020 in feminist economics. So Stephanie, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Firstly, I would just like to thank the Asia Floor Wage Alliance for inviting me to participate. I think this is an excellent report. We've had a lot of anecdotal information about the impact of COVID on workers. But what this report does is that it provides systematic and concrete evidence across a number of countries, which gives prominence to workers' voice and workers' perspectives. So this is really important data and information, which I think will support many different programs, campaigns, and research. The second point, I also, just as a researcher, I know that the difficulty in the Capturing the Gains program, which was in 20 different institutions, I know the problem of coordinating large research studies involving many countries, many researchers, but I really commend the AFWA for producing at the end of it a very succinct and clearly written and clearly structured report, which I think will help to inform. What I want to focus on is the gender dimension. And again, excellent in the report is that it has a lot of gender data and information. And I just want to pick up on some of the key points. The first is that a number of people say, and this report clearly supports, that the COVID-19 has disproportionately adversely affected women. And this is really important in the garment sector, where 60 million workers, 60 to 70% of those are women. So women hold up the garment sector, and yet they have been the most disproportionately affected. But also that the report clearly shows is that what COVID has done is to highlight structural and systemic inequalities and asymmetric power, as has been highlighted, which already existed. So it's nothing new, but it's really brought it to the fore. And this is reflected in relation to gender on various dimensions. Firstly, the wage gap. the wage gap is a gendered wage gap, which has been there for a very long time. What my research and others' research has shown is this, the gender wage gap, which is often justified on the basis that women don't deserve or shouldn't be paid as much, is wrong. What women do is contribute a very large amount of skill, often skill that they acquire in their own homes and socially acquired. They bring a lot of skill into the production of garments, but that skill is under-recognized and under-remunerated. In other words, they generate value which they are not proportionately rewarded for. And it's that unrewarded value that is then captured further along the value chain by suppliers, but particularly by the brands, because that skill is really critical to attaining the quality that gets the high price at the end of the chain. And what COVID has done is really re-emphasized that, but also potentially pushed women back even further in terms of widening the wage gap. And this is really a major challenge which the report highlights and that needs to be addressed. The next point that I want to make, and I think that builds a bit on Ratna's point, relates to the relationship between production, commercial production, and social reproduction. Feminist economists have long argued that there is a link between the two. They should not be separated. But so often, as others have said, economists, conventional economists do separate them. Businesses separate them. What you do in your home life is your affair. If you're in the factory, you have to work. But what COVID has done is to really highlight the interlink between the two, that what happens to workers in the factory has an immediate impact onto their households. It increased poverty, it increased problems in terms of debt, it increased problems of nutrition, education of children, health. But also I think what COVID has done, and this is highlighted to some extent in the report, is that what happens in the household impacts back onto the factory and onto production. So those linkages are really critical, and that if you're going to support workers and have a more gender equitable recovery, then you need to provide support not just for workers in the factory and provide a living wage, but also understand the relationship to the household and need to support those households. And this is where I think the living wage argument of the Asia Wage Alliance has been so important, because without a living wage, households cannot develop, cannot subsist. Children will not be able to go to school without a living wage. So therefore, if we do want global value chains that do support development, and I argue that global value chains, and it's mentioned in the report, have in some ways been great for women in that they've generated paid jobs. That's been a big advance. The problem is those jobs have been so poorly remunerated. And what COVID has done is really highlighted that, and the report clearly demonstrates low wage workers, disproportionately women, because they're concentrated in the lowest wage and the most insecure work, means they don't have savings, they don't have assets, they've been the least resilient in the face of the crisis. And the way the brands cut and run, many brands cut and run, and the risks were pushed down onto those workers, meant that those workers have disproportionately carried the burden of the COVID crisis. So just to finish off, I think the way forward, and I think also this is really important. I greatly welcome the report. It has excellent information. I think it could have been stronger at the end about how important the recovery needs to be a gender equitable recovery. And for it to be a gender equitable recovery, there are a few just quick issues. Firstly, workers, as the unions know, and I come from Manchester, which is the first, historically, the first area of mass production of garments. industrial production of garments. But as the unions know and as workers' struggle know, gains are only made for workers and for women through struggle and through contestation. But women have to be a core part of that. And I think particularly the organisation of workers and this in trade unions is really important, but especially the organisation and unionisation of the least secure workers, the casual workers, the contract workers. I know it's difficult, but they have to be organised as well, from the weakest to the strongest. That's the way we're going to be able to contest and get better pay and conditions are more gender equitable. The second one is social contract, the new social contract. A number of people are talking about this. I would just love to see a bit more emphasis on a gender equitable new social contract. So I think that's really an important dimension that some excellent people are talking about it, but that has got to be emphasized, because without gender equity, a value chain is as weak as its weakest link. And then the final thing is the living wage. There will be no development and there will be no building back better or whatever you want to talk without a living wage. That has to be a gender equitable living wage, so that the rewards go to women as well as male workers in terms of their contribution to the apparel, the garment value chain. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Well, just a few points that have come up in this discussion, and then I don't know how you want to carry this forward, Ananya. I think we have overshot the time, so we may not have much time for questions and answers. So I don't know how you take it forward. Anyway, just a couple of points. First of all, the importance of the report, that we have not just anecdotes, but cross-country data that we can compare and be able to document the nature of the wage losses and wage theft that we all know have been occurring. So this is very important for not just your purposes, but even for overall, for advocacy of different types, for analysis too. It's very important to be able to carry this forward. Secondly, the point made that, what are we seeing over here? We are seeing a kind of intensification of a reverse subsidy. There are subsidies that are extracted or captured from workers in these garment factories in the South, and they become the global profits of the big brands. But these have been, because of monopoly capitalism, these have been intensified or increased in this pandemic, where the wage losses suffered have actually supported, in a way, the share prices of these companies, which have not suffered. So if they had utilized their cash reserves to pay the workers, there would have been some effect on their balance sheets and perhaps on the share prices. But no, they prefer to, they need to, or they're required to support their share prices rather than to pay the workers who are captive. That is exactly the point about monopoly capitalism. Neither the suppliers can leave these brands, nor the workers who work for these suppliers can leave employment. Therefore, the brands are very confident. They know very well that when business starts again, which is what happened, then the suppliers will be there, the workers will be back. And so they don't have to worry about what happens in the interim, whether there's a huge humanitarian crisis. Your documents show how much the workers have suffered semi-starvation in this period, and surely it will affect the very future of these working class families, including the education of their children. But what's important is that this is a very gendered wage structure, a very gendered working class. There are links between the factory and the household. So it's very important, as your report brings out, and as we talk about in terms of what is the way forward. Everybody is talking about what can be the new social contract. Well, the old social contract was that cheap labor and is utilized to keep down the prices of basic commodities like food and clothes and shoes. which allows you in the north to keep down wages. So you don't have to worry about keeping up your wages. You have a social contract that wages will go down, but the real wage will not go down as much because you will have cheap commodities coming in from the south. So we need to have a new social contract, the base of which needs to be a living wage. And we have to really see in a gender equitable manner, as was stressed by some of the workers, some of the discussants here, and the workers in what they presented. So we have to think of a gender equitable way forward, which will really be able to allow us to change the manner in which the entire bargains are now being made and the manner in which labor is forced into this monopsony capitalist system. So I think, Ananya, I don't know how you would like to carry this forward, but I think that has been some of our discussion. I will only say that, again, this is a very important report, not for its methodology, which is robust and allows us to have data across countries. As Stephanie said, we all know how difficult it is to get comparable data across countries, and you have done that, and we must congratulate your researchers and your field enumerators from the trade unions who've been able to put together this very important report and make a sense out of it. Not just put together numbers, but tell us what they mean. Thank you.
So actually we had planned, as you know, for a discussion, but I think we have really run out of time. But Dave, have you received, I think the tech team may have sent you any questions, because a lot of questions have come in, we know that. And they have been fielding some of those questions themselves. But do you have maybe one question that you want to?
Well, there are a few comments on the living wage, which I think has been.
Yeah, not so much the comments. Yeah, any questions that
No
you
real
want?
question. I don't see
Okay.
any real
Okay.
questions.
All right.
But I would again say the way in which the living wage has come up is very important, because it's a simple thing. What is the cost of labor power? The living wage is really the cost of producing labor power. If you are paying a wage which is lower than the cost of producing the labor power, somewhere somebody is subsidizing that wage, and that is the bodies of the workers who wear themselves out. You know, the women are forced out of garment factories by the age of 35. And this is so across all of these countries that you have studied. Age of 35, you know, many of us are just beginning our careers at the age of 35. And here you can think of women who are ending their working careers in the factories at the age of 35. So all of this is part of the enormous subsidies that are being extracted out of workers in these garment factories through the global monopolist system of the value chains.
Okay, well, this has been a dream for us to bring trade unionists who speak in different languages, along with different language groups of 9
Okay,
languages.
I see a question. There is a question has just been put up here.
Okay.
How does the social upgrading optic via economic upgrading hold true against this report? This is a question for Gary and Stephanie. How does the social upgrading optic via economic upgrading hold true against this report? Stephanie,
in the interest of time, Dev, I think Steph had some very practical, I think, recommendations coming from the gender equity side, and others that are sort of from the regions might have the practical suggestions for moving forward, which I think some of the questions were asking about. So I'll cede my time to Steph or anybody else who might want to address it from a practical point of view.
Yeah, I just know that's a great question, Kanchana, and it's I think what certainly in my book on gender, I really focused on the downward pressures, economic and social downgrading pressures versus the economic and social upgrading pressures. And I think you see both. What COVID-19 has really done has been to greatly increase the downward pressures, the economic and social downgrading. And that is the risk. And some people talk about us on the gender side going back 30 years in terms of the gains that have been made by women. If we're going to turn that around and ensure that we get the upgrading, economic and social upgrading, then we've got to have the contestation be, I think, this a new social contract I'm fine with, so long as it's gender equitable and really promotes a living wage, and that will lead to a potentially upgrading. But this isn't going to come about automatically. It's going to take a struggle and campaigning, etc.
Okay, so I think we are finally out of time, and really grateful to the audience for staying with us. I wanted to just make a final comment so that you know the way forward now. This is part of a two-part global series. This was the first part where we are laying out the problem, the wage theft that has happened. Wage theft is basically a violation of the rule of law. And what we see here is that global brands have violated the rule of law in national countries, in the production countries, by committing wage theft. And they need to be held legally responsible. And this is where national laws and union agency must be respected. And this will be the topic of the second half of the two-part global series, which will be at the same time next week. And in that panel, you will be listening to legal and labor experts on the idea of joint employer liability, which is a strategy that Asian unions are committing to. We will also be releasing a publication on this later this week, so you'll be hearing from us. So stay tuned, and please come on July 14th to listen to, again, labor and legal experts, both Asian and international, on the topic of joint employer liability. I wanted to give a big round of applause and a lot of gratitude for our speakers today, our academics, for all your wisdom and expertise, for our trade union leaders, for their courage and for their just hard work and commitment in these times. It's just been an amazing journey this whole year. So thank you, everybody. We are extremely grateful for our ability to come together on an online platform. Honestly, a physical event like this is beyond our resources. So this is really the, I would say, although the online is a challenge, can you imagine that people have come together from 45 countries? We could never afford such a thing, the labor movement of all. And at the peak of our program, we had close to 320, 330 people participating. And of course, it has fluctuated a bit. So we have had a lot of good people come in. Thank you very much. We can close the program for today. And good night and good day to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you, everyone. Good night and goodbye.